There is a civilization in the historical record that lasted so long it makes every other ancient culture look like a brief experiment. The Romans, who considered themselves the inheritors of all human achievement, looked at Egypt and felt something close to awe, because by the time Julius Caesar sailed into Alexandria, the pyramids at Giza were already older to him than Caesar is to us. The priests who served in those temples were the custodians of a tradition so ancient that even they could not read the oldest inscriptions. 5,000 years of continuous kings, continuous gods, continuous floods and harvests along the same river. And the question is not merely what happened, but how something human lasted that long. This is Quiet Chronicles, where history runs through the night. If this kind of storytelling is worth something to you, a like and a quiet subscription keep the channel going. New episodes arrive each week. Tonight, the chronicle begins where Egypt itself began, before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, in the time when the Nile Valley held a dozen competing kingdoms, and one of them was about to swallow the rest. Chapter 1: The Stone Before the Kingdom. Before there was a pharaoh, there was a river and the people who learned to read it. The Nile Valley in the 4th millennium BCE was not a unified country, but a collection of competing chiefdoms stretched across a thin corridor of cultivable land, green and narrow against the desert on both sides, each with its own local gods, its own burial customs, its own sense of where power came from and who deserved to hold it. The consolidation of all of that into a single state is one of the most consequential administrative events in human history, and it happened gradually enough that no single moment marks the beginning, only a series of objects and names that tell us something was already becoming. The culture archaeologists call Nakata III, named for a site in Upper Egypt where its characteristic pottery was first identified, spread northward through the valley during the centuries around 3200 BCE, absorbing or displacing the competing regional cultures that had developed independently along different stretches of the river. The evidence of this expansion is mostly ceramic and funerary. Pottery styles that appear first in Upper Egypt begin showing up in Lower Egyptian burial sites. Administrative seals with Upper Egyptian designs appear in Delta contexts, and the burial practices associated with the Southern tradition gradually replace the ones that had been native to the North. This was not necessarily conquest in the military sense in all places and at all times. Some of it was trade, some of it was migration, some of it was the slow prestige of a culture that had developed more sophisticated administrative tools than its neighbors, and found those tools spreading ahead of any army. Among those tools was something that would define Egypt for the next 3,000 years, the earliest form of hieroglyphic writing. Not yet the full script that would eventually record the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead, but proto-hieroglyphs, small pictographic signs inscribed on pottery, ivory tags, and clay seal impressions that were already functioning as administrative labels rather than decorative marks. A tag attached to a jar in a royal storehouse at Abydos, bearing a sign that could be read as a place name or a quantity, is performing a bureaucratic function. It is not art. It is record keeping, and the appearance of record keeping at the same moment that the Nakata III culture is consolidating political authority across the valley is not coincidental. A state that controls a surplus needs to count it. Among the earliest named rulers anywhere in this record are the figures Egyptologists call the Scorpion Kings. Two of them, designated Scorpion I and Scorpion II, their names reconstructed from a scorpion sign that appears on the artifacts associated with their reigns. Scorpion I is the more shadowy of the two. Known from inscribed labels at Abydos, his existence inferred from a handful of signs rather than from any continuous account. Scorpion II is somewhat better attested, and the object most directly connected to him, a large ceremonial mace head found at Heracleopolis, the great pre-dynastic city of Upper Egypt, is one of the most revealing artifacts from this entire period. The mace head depicts a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, standing in a posture of ceremony, holding what appears to be a hoe or a digging instrument. Around him are figures that suggest a formal occasion: fan bearers, standard bearers, attendants, and in the scene's lower register there are canals, or the suggestion of them, and birds in nets. The scholarly interpretation of this scene is that it depicts a royal irrigation ceremony, the king ritually breaking ground on a canal or waterway, inaugurating the agricultural infrastructure that would make the flood surplus usable. Whether this is literally what the mace head shows, or a more symbolic program of royal fertility and control, the logic is the same. The first thing the Scorpion King is depicted doing in the oldest surviving image of a named Egyptian ruler is managing water. The connection between kingship and the Nile's control was not a later ideological invention. It was already the foundational claim of power before the dynasty began. Hierakonpolis itself deserves a moment. It was, at this period, one of the largest settlements in the Nile Valley, possibly the largest, a city of several thousand people with a developed craft industry, a ceremonial precinct, and evidence of long-distance trade reaching into the Levant and possibly into Mesopotamia. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone whose nearest ancient source was the mines of Badakhshan in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, has been found at pre-dynastic sites in Egypt, which means that even before the dynastic state existed, the people of the Nile Valley were embedded in trade networks of extraordinary reach. The lapis passed through Mesopotamian intermediaries, arriving in Egypt as a luxury material that marked status and connected its owners to a world larger than the valley. Obsidian from the Red Sea region appeared alongside it. Cedar timber from the Lebanese coast showed up in elite burials whose wood requirements exceeded anything local forests could supply. The two competing crowns of this period, the white crown associated with Upper Egypt, the red crown associated with Lower Egypt, were already functioning as political symbols before anyone had combined them. The vulture goddess Nekhbet claimed Upper Egypt as her domain. The cobra goddess Wadjet presided over the delta. These were not merely religious distinctions. They mapped onto genuine political and ecological differences. Upper Egypt was the narrow valley, the corridor between the desert scarps, organized around a single channel of the river. Lower Egypt was the delta, broad and marshy and multiple channeled, opening onto the Mediterranean and facing outward toward the sea. The cultures that developed in these two environments were distinct enough that their eventual unification required not just military consolidation, but ideological work, a symbolic program that could hold both in a single frame. That work was already beginning in the Naqada III period. Objects bearing the iconography of both crowns appear in this period, suggesting that the people making them were already imagining or performing a unified polity before one formally existed. The white and red crowns appear together on seals and pottery in ways that suggest the idea of their combination was circulating before anyone had achieved it in practice. Whether this amounts to a propaganda campaign by an expanding Upper Egyptian elite or simply reflects the natural symbolic vocabulary of a culture in the process of political merger is difficult to say. The objects survive, the intentions behind them do not. The funerary record of this period carries its own weight of evidence. The royal and elite burials at Abydos, a site in Upper Egypt that would remain the most sacred burial ground in the dynastic tradition, were already elaborate in the Naqada III period, the tombs lined with mud brick, furnished with quantities of pottery, stone vessels, and imported goods that required a substantial economic mobilization to assemble. This was not just wealth display. The scale of the grave goods implied a belief system in which the dead required provisioning for a continued existence, and the scale of that provisioning for a royal burial implied a court capable of organizing and directing considerable resources toward a single ceremonial purpose. The administrative capacity that built a royal tomb in 3200 BCE was not qualitatively different from the administrative capacity that would build a pyramid 300 years later. It was the same machinery learning to think larger. Alongside the royal burials at Abydos were subsidiary burials, smaller graves arranged around the royal tomb containing the bodies of servants, officials, or retainers who were interred at the time of the king's death. The interpretation of these burials has been debated. Whether the people buried in them were killed as part of the royal funeral rites or died of other causes and were granted the honor of burial near the king is not entirely settled by the archaeological evidence. What the subsidiary burials demonstrate unambiguously is that the dead king's household was conceived as something that extended into the afterlife, that the royal person required attendance not just in life but in death, and that the state had both the authority and the organizational capacity to arrange for it. Trade was one of the mechanisms by which the Naqada III culture spread its influence, but it was also one of the mechanisms by which a southern elite accumulated the surpluses that funded military and political expansion. Control of trade routes through the valley, particularly the route between the southern quarries and mining regions and the northern delta, meant control of the materials that made wealth visible: the gold from the eastern desert, the copper from Sinai, the semi-precious stones from the desert wadis. A chieftain who could tax or redirect these flows had access to a different order of resources than one who could not, and the Naqada III evidence suggests that the Upper Egyptian polities were doing exactly this in the centuries before unification. The proto-hieroglyphic script that was developing alongside this consolidation was not, in these early stages, a literary tool. It was an accounting tool. The earliest inscribed objects from this period record quantities of goods, names of estates, marks of ownership, the administrative residue of a redistributive economy in which a center collected surplus and dispersed it. Writing appeared in Egypt not to tell stories, but to keep track of things, which is why it appears at the same moment as the state and not before it. The two developments are inseparable because they are responses to the same problem. How does a political center maintain control over territory and resources too large and complex to manage through memory and direct observation alone? The answer, writing, sealing, labeling, counting, shaped Egypt for the next 3 millennia. The hieroglyphic script that began as an administrative shorthand would eventually carry religious texts, royal propaganda, poetry, and medical knowledge. But it began as a way of knowing what was in the jars. By the time the Nakata III period reaches its conclusion, the valley is not yet unified, but it is already oriented toward unification. The competing chiefdoms have reduced in number through absorption and competition. The dominant culture is recognizably the one that will produce the first dynasty. The symbolic vocabulary of kingship, the crowns, the falcon god Horus as royal patron, the serpent and the vulture as emblems of the two lands, is already in circulation. What remains is the final consolidation, the act or series of acts that will be remembered in the later tradition as the work of a single king. That king is standing just beyond this chapter, holding two crowns and a question about whether he can make them one. His name survives on an object that is, in its own way, as eloquent as anything Egypt ever produced, and it is where the chronicle turns next. Chapter 2: What the Flood Made Possible. The king standing at the threshold of the first dynasty inherited not just a collection of competing chiefdoms, but a river, and understanding what that river actually did in physical and agricultural terms is the only way to understand why the civilization that grew beside it took the particular shape it did. Everything that follows in Egyptian history, the pyramids, the bureaucracy, the theology of divine kingship, the monuments that still interrupt the desert skyline, rests on an annual event of such reliable abundance that it functioned less like a natural phenomenon and more like a fiscal policy. The Nile flood was the Egyptian economy. Everything else was built on top of it. The inundation arrived in Egypt each year around late June or early July, fed by the summer monsoon rains falling thousands of miles to the south on the Ethiopian highlands. The Blue Nile, swollen with that rainfall, carried with it an enormous load of fine sediment, volcanic silt from the highland soils, and when it reached the valley, it spread across the low-lying fields on either side of the river channel, depositing that sediment as it slowed and eventually receded. By October or November, when the waters pulled back, they left behind a layer of dark, mineral-rich mud that required almost no amendment to produce a crop. Egyptian farmers did not need to rotate fields, did not need to fallow, did not need to supplement their soil with manure or compost in the way that agricultural systems elsewhere required. The river fed the fields every year, and the fields produced every year, and the surplus accumulated in state granaries with a consistency that no rain-dependent agricultural system could match. The specific crops that Egyptian farmers grew in that renewed soil were emmer wheat and barley, the two staple grains of the ancient Near Eastern world, sown in November after the flood receded and harvested in March or April before the heat of summer made the fields unworkable. This growing season, squeezed between the flood's retreat and the summer's advance, was short but extraordinarily productive. Yield ratios, the amount of grain harvested relative to the amount sown in Egyptian agriculture, were among the highest in the ancient world, which is why Egypt became eventually the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. The Romans did not prize Egypt as a province because of its monuments. They prized it because its grain fed their cities. Between the river and the fields lay a technology that was ancient even by dynastic standards, the basin irrigation system. Egyptian farmers did not simply wait for the flood to spread where it would. They organized the land beside the river into a series of shallow basins, enclosed by earthen bunds or embankments, that trapped the floodwater and held it on the fields long enough for the silt to settle and the soil to saturate. When sufficient time had passed, the bunds were breached and the water drained back to the river or into the next basin downstream. The sequence required coordination among the farmers of an entire stretch of riverbank because the embankments that served one field affected the water flow available to the fields beside and below it. No individual family could manage this system alone. It required collective organization across a territory large enough to encompass an entire drainage basin, which is, in miniature, the organizational logic that produced the Nomi system, the nomarchs, and eventually the state itself. The nome was the basic administrative unit of Egyptian governance from the earliest dynasties onward, a territory corresponding roughly to a natural irrigation basin with its own local deity, its own capital town, and its own administrator. In the Old Kingdom, these administrators were called nomarchs, and their authority was grounded in precisely the kind of local water management that the basin system required. A nomarch who understood his nome's hydrology, who could organize the maintenance of the bunds and the timing of the releases, was performing a function that was simultaneously agricultural, administrative, and political. The connection between water management and political authority in Egypt was not metaphorical, it was hydraulic. The measurement of the flood was, by any standard, one of the most consequential administrative acts the Egyptian state performed each year, and the instrument for performing it was the nilometer, a calibrated stone staircase or column built at a point where the river's level could be observed and recorded as the flood rose and fell. The most important of these, and the oldest whose physical remains survive, was at Elephantine, the island at the first cataract, the traditional southern boundary of Egypt proper, where the Nile emerged from the granite outcroppings of the cataract and entered the valley. The Elephantine nilometer was not merely a measuring device. It was an early warning system, a tax assessment tool, and a theological instrument all at once. A reading taken at Elephantine in late June as the flood began to rise could be transmitted northward to the capital by messenger, by relay stations along the river, and give the state weeks of advance notice about what kind of year was coming. A flood that reached a certain height on the nilometer scale meant a good inundation, enough water to saturate the basins, enough silt to renew the fields, enough agricultural surplus to fill the granaries and sustain the redistributive economy. A flood that rose too high meant catastrophe of a different kind. Embankments overwhelmed, villages submerged, seed grain destroyed. A flood that failed to reach the necessary height meant a thin deposit of silt, a reduced harvest, and the prospect of shortages that could destabilize a state whose entire fiscal architecture depended on surplus. The nilometer reading was not a curiosity. It was the year's first budget projection. Tax assessment in Egypt followed from the flood measurement, with a directness that left little room for negotiation. A high reading meant a high yield, meant a higher tax obligation, the state's claim on a fixed proportion of a larger harvest. A low reading reduced that obligation proportionally, not out of administrative generosity, but out of the practical recognition that a state which overtaxed a bad harvest would find nothing left to tax the following year. The system required accurate measurement, honest reporting, and an administrative apparatus capable of translating a water level on a stone column into a set of obligations distributed across thousands of farms spread across hundreds of kilometers of riverbank. That the system functioned for 3,000 years is testimony not to its simplicity, but to its institutional robustness. The god who presided over all of this was Happy, depicted as a heavy-set figure with blue or green skin, carrying lotus plants and fish, pendulous with the abundance he represented. Happy was the deity of the annual inundation, and the offerings made to him before and during the flood season were not purely ceremonial. They were a form of risk management in a world without weather forecasting, directed at the entity understood to control the most consequential variable in the Egyptian economy. A state that depended on the flood for its entire surplus had strong incentives to maintain good relations with the force responsible for delivering it, and the priesthoods that managed those relations, the ceremonies, the offerings, the architectural monuments to divine generosity, were not separate from the economic life of the valley. They were part of it. The corvée labor system, the obligation of Egyptian subjects to contribute labor to state projects for a portion of each year, was organized around the flood's calendar in a way that transformed a natural rhythm into a construction schedule. The months when the Nile was at its height and the fields were submerged were the months when agricultural labor was unavailable and the workforce was, in a structural sense, idle. It was during this period that the state mobilized workers for its great building projects, not because the Egyptians were uniquely ingenious in identifying an underutilized labor surplus, but because the flood itself created the surplus by temporarily removing the fields from production. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza were not, in the main, slaves driven to their labor by compulsion. They were farmers whose fields were underwater, receiving rations of bread and beer and onions from state granaries, contributing their labor to a project whose theological significance they understood and in many cases participated in willingly. The evidence for this comes from the workers' villages excavated at Giza, a settlement of some permanence, with bakeries, breweries, a medical facility whose records include evidence of surgical interventions and recovery, and administrative documents recording the rotation of work gangs and the quantities of supplies distributed to them. The graffiti left by the work gangs themselves, names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkur, scratched onto stones, suggest groups with a collective identity and perhaps a degree of competitive pride in their work. This is not the forced labor of a conquered population. It is a drafted workforce organized through a redistributive economy, and understanding it correctly changes what the pyramids mean as a human achievement. The broader logic of Egyptian agricultural surplus extended beyond labor mobilization into every aspect of the state's capacity. The granaries that held the harvest were the treasury, because grain was the primary medium of value in a society that did not yet use coinage. Officials were paid in grain, workers were rationed in grain, Temples were endowed with agricultural land whose yields sustained their priesthoods and their ceremonies. The state that controlled the granaries controlled the economy, and the state that controlled the economy controlled everything downstream of it: the armies, the building projects, the diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, the maintenance of the irrigation infrastructure whose proper functioning made the next harvest possible. Egypt's civilization was, at its foundation, a very sophisticated way of turning an annual flood into a self-sustaining institutional complex. All of that, the basin system, the nilometer readings, the corvée schedule, the grain-based redistributive economy, was already in place in its essential form before the first dynasty began. The dynastic state inherited it, formalized it, extended its administrative reach, and built upon it the theological and monumental superstructure that would make Egypt recognizable across the next 3 millennia. But the river was there first. The farmers who learned to read it were there first. The organizational logic that the flood imposed on the people living beside it was there first. What the first pharaohs did was give that logic a face, a name, and a crown, and then spend the next 5,000 years insisting that the face was divine. The man who first wore both crowns, whose palette records the act of unification in a visual program of startling clarity, stepped into a structure that the river had already built for him. His name was Narmer, and what he left behind is small enough to hold in two hands and consequential enough to have changed the world. Chapter 3: The King Who Joined the Crowns. Narmer's palette is 64 centimeters of gray-wacka stone, shaped like a cosmetic palette, the kind used to grind pigment for eye paint, but far too large and too elaborately carved ever to have served that purpose in any practical sense. It was a ceremonial object, probably displayed in a temple, and it was found at Hierakonpolis in 1898 by the British archaeologists James Quibell and Frederick Green, buried in a deposit of ritual objects that had been interred together at some point in antiquity. When Quibell first examined it, he was holding the oldest historical document in the world, not the oldest writing, not the oldest art, but the oldest surviving object that records a named ruler performing a named act with a political meaning that can still be read. One face of the palette shows Narmer wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. He stands in the posture that Egyptian art would use for the smiting pharaoh for the next 3,000 years, one arm raised, the other gripping an enemy by the hair, while a kneeling figure awaits the blow below him. A falcon perches on a papyrus thicket beside him, holding a rope attached to a human head emerging from the plants, which Egyptologists read as the god Horus, the royal patron deity, delivering the people of the Delta to the king. In the lower register, two more figures lie prone, their heads placed neatly beside their feet. The other face shows Narmer wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, moving in procession to inspect the bodies of decapitated enemies, preceded by standard bearers carrying the emblems of his nomes. At the palette's center, two long-necked felines, their necks intertwined by handlers, frame the circular depression where pigment would have been ground if the object had been a working tool rather than a statement of power. Whether the palette depicts historical events, an actual campaign in which Narmer conquered the Delta and executed its leaders, or a symbolic program of legitimation that condensed a longer process of political consolidation into a single image of royal triumph, is a question that cannot be definitively answered. The scholarly consensus has shifted over the decades, and the current tendency is to see the palette as ideological rather than documentary, a visual argument for a particular understanding of kingship rather than a battle report. But the distinction may matter less than it seems. In Egypt, the image of the king smiting his enemies was not merely propaganda, it was theology. The pharaoh's defeat of chaos, represented by foreign enemies, by disorder, by anything that threatened the ordered world the gods had established, was his primary cosmic function, and depicting him performing that function was itself a form of performing it. The palette did not record a victory, it enacted one. Narmer is identified with Menes in the later tradition. The Greek historian Herodotus and the Egyptian priest Manetho both name Menes as the first king of a unified Egypt, the founder of Memphis, the originator of the dynastic sequence. Whether Narmer and Menes are the same person, or whether Menes is a later composite figure absorbing the memory of several early rulers into a single legendary founder, remains unresolved. What is clear is that the figure the historical record calls Narmer stands at the beginning of the first dynasty, that his name appears on objects from both Upper and Lower Egypt, and that those objects represent a geographic distribution of royal authority that previous rulers had not achieved. The founding of Memphis, called Ineb Hedge, the White Walls, in the earliest sources, was among the most consequential decisions of the early dynastic period, and its logic was geographic before it was anything else. Memphis sat at the apex of the delta, the precise point where the Nile Valley narrowed into its single corridor before opening into the multiple channels of the lower Egyptian fan. A city built at that junction could administer both regions from a central position that neither Upper nor Lower Egypt could claim exclusively as its own. It was a capital designed to be neutral ground, not Upper Egyptian, not Lower Egyptian, but the place where the two lands met and were governed as one. The city would remain the administrative heart of Egypt in one form or another for the next 3,000 years. The early dynastic period, the first and second dynasties, covering roughly the centuries between 3000 and 2686 BCE, is known primarily through its royal burials at Abydos and through the administrative debris that survives in the form of seal impressions, labels, and pottery marks. The kings who followed Narmer, Aha, Jer, Jet, Den, Enegib, Semerket, Qua in the first dynasty, Raneb, Ninetcher, Weneg, Senej, Seth Peribsen, Kasekemwi in the second, are names attached to tombs and to objects rather than to events in any narrative sense. Their reigns are durations, their achievements inferred from the scale of their burials and the distribution of their administrative seals across the country. Den is worth pausing on. His reign, somewhere in the middle of the first dynasty, produced the first image of a pharaoh wearing the double crown, the white crown of Upper Egypt fitted inside the red crown of Lower Egypt, combined into the single composite symbol of unified sovereignty that every subsequent ruler would wear. Whether this means Den was the first king to fully realize the unification that Narmer had initiated, or simply the first for whom an image of the double crown happens to survive, is uncertain. The object itself, A small ivory label from Abydos shows Den running a ritual race while wearing the combined crowns, and the image's casualness is striking. The double crown is not presented as a new or remarkable thing. It appears to be an established symbol, worn without ceremony, suggesting that by Den's reign, the unification it represented had become institutional fact rather than ideological aspiration. The royal tombs at Abydos were built from mud brick in the desert margin west of the valley, in an area that had served as an elite burial ground since the predynastic period. The First Dynasty tombs are substantial structures, multiple chambers, storerooms for the grave goods, outer enclosures, and around the main royal chamber, in subsidiary graves arranged in orderly rows, were the burials of retainers, servants, and court officials whose deaths appear to coincide with the deaths of the kings beside whom they were interred. The practice, called retainer sacrifice by archaeologists, though the evidence of volition among those buried is ambiguous, continued through the early First Dynasty and then diminished and eventually ceased. By the end of the dynasty, the subsidiary burials are replaced by wooden models and pottery figures that serve the same symbolic function without the human cost. The shift tells us something about how the early dynastic state was learning to manage the demands of royal ideology. Where the first dynasty kings required an actual household in the afterlife, their successors were satisfied with a represented one. The administrative reach of these early kings extended further than the physical extent of their monuments might suggest. Seal impressions bearing royal names have been found at sites across Egypt and into the Sinai and the southern Levant, indicating that the redistributive economy of the early state was operating at a scale that required tracking goods across significant distances. The turquoise mines of the Sinai, already being worked in this period, produced a luxury material that the state claimed and distributed, and the copper deposits of the same region supplied the tools that built the monuments and equipped the court. These were not casual trading relationships. They were administered resource flows, managed by a bureaucracy that could record, track, and redirect materials across a political territory larger than most contemporary states anywhere in the world. The Serek, the rectangular panel surmounted by a falcon, within which the royal name was written, was the primary graphic symbol of royal identity in this period, preceding the cartouche that would replace it in the Old Kingdom. Its design encodes an ideology. The lower portion of the Serek is conventionally read as the facade of the palace, its niched brickwork representing the royal residence, while the falcon of Horus perches on top, the god physically inhabiting the palace and thus the king within it. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler with divine approval. He was understood to be the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, son of Osiris, whose legitimate kingship over Egypt was established in the mythological narrative that the dynastic state adopted as its own founding story. The Serek made this claim visible every time a royal name appeared on a jar, a seal, or a monument face. The second dynasty is murkier than the first, its sequence of kings less clearly established, its monuments less well preserved, and one episode from it is genuinely strange. Two kings of the dynasty, Seth-Peribsen and Khasa-Khemui, seem to have been involved in some kind of political or theological conflict in which the royal deity briefly shifted from Horus to Seth, the god of chaos and disorder, Horus's mythological antagonist, before being restored. Khufu's name is particularly interesting. It means something like, the two powers appear, and his Seraph is uniquely surmounted by both the Horus falcon and the Seth animal, as if his reign represented the resolution of a conflict whose nature the surviving record does not fully explain. The episode is a reminder that the ideological program of unified kingship was not a settled condition in the early dynasties, but an ongoing argument conducted in the language of theology about the nature and location of legitimate authority. By the reign of Khufu, the second dynasty was moving toward its close, and with it the early dynastic period. The administrative institutions were in place. The redistributive economy was functioning. The royal burial ground at Abydos was accumulating its sequence of tombs. The Horus kingship, the identification of the pharaoh with the falcon god, the living embodiment of cosmic order, was the foundational ideology of the state. What was not yet in place was the form of monument that would make Egypt legible to every subsequent civilization that encountered it. That was about to change, and it would change because of a single king with an unusual name and an architect whose ambition ran in the same direction as the sky. Chapter 4: The Age of Pyramids and Its Exhaustion. The decision to build in stone changed what Egypt meant, not just to itself, but to every civilization that would encounter it afterward. Mud brick was the standard building material of the ancient Near East, durable enough for a generation or two, suitable for palaces and temples and administrative centers, but not permanent in any geological sense. Stone was different. Stone said something about time that mud brick could not, that the institution placing it intended to last longer than any individual reign, any single dynasty, any political arrangement that human beings might manage to disrupt. When Djoser's architect Imhotep chose limestone for the structure rising above the king's burial chamber at Saqqara, he was not merely solving an engineering problem. He was making a theological argument in the most durable medium available. Imhotep is the first named architect in the historical record, the first person in all of human history whose name survives attached to a specific building rather than inferred from administrative documents or royal inscriptions. His titles, recorded on the base of a statue of Djoser found at Saqqara, include Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, first after the King of Upper Egypt, High Priest of Heliopolis, and Overseer of Works, a combination of administrative, religious, and technical authority that suggests his position was as close to a second king as the Egyptian court permitted. The building he produced for Djoser, begun around 2650 BCE, was the Step Pyramid, a structure that began as a mastaba, the flat-topped rectangular tomb that was the standard royal burial form of the early dynastic period, and was extended, enlarged, and built upward in a series of stages until it reached 6 steps and a height of 60 meters, becoming the largest stone structure in the world at the moment of its completion. The mastaba to pyramid transition was not a single inspired decision, but an iterative process, and the archaeology of Saqqara preserves its stages. Imhotep began with a square mastaba larger than any of its predecessors, then extended it on all 4 sides, then placed a smaller mastaba on top and another on top of that, ascending the profile in steps toward the sky. Whether the final 6-step form was planned from the beginning, or arrived at through a series of expansions, remains debated, but the result was unmistakable: a staircase of stone rising from the desert floor, oriented precisely to the cardinal points, enclosing the king's burial chamber deep in its bedrock beneath, surrounded by a walled ceremonial complex of temples, courtyards, and subsidiary structures that covered an area of nearly 16 hectares. Nothing like it had existed before. The complex at Saqqara was not merely a tomb, it was a stage set for the eternal performance of kingship, designed to allow the dead king to continue exercising his ritual functions in the afterlife as he had in life. The subsidiary structures within the enclosure wall, the temples, the dummy buildings with their sealed stone doors carved to look perpetually ajar, the running track on which the king would perform the said festival race for eternity, were built for a performance that had no living audience. They were built for the king and the gods. The fact that they were built in stone at full scale with the same quality of construction as any functional building tells us something about how seriously the Egyptian state took the afterlife as an institutional reality rather than a metaphysical hope. What Imhotep began at Saqqara, Sneferu extended and perfected. The second king of the fourth dynasty, Sneferu, reigned for somewhere between 24 and 48 years. The sources are inconsistent, and during that reign he built not one pyramid, but three, in a sequence of architectural experiments whose combined volume of stone exceeds that of any single subsequent pyramid, including the Great Pyramid of Khufu. The first, at Medum, was begun as a step pyramid and later modified with a smooth outer casing that filled in the steps to create a true pyramid profile. But the modification was structurally inadequate, and at some point, possibly during construction or possibly later, the outer casing collapsed, leaving the stepped core exposed and surrounded by a skirt of rubble that still buries the structure's lower third. The second, at Dashur, shows the problem of the true pyramid form being solved in real time. The bent pyramid begins at an angle of 54 degrees, and then, at roughly halfway up its height, abruptly shifts to 43 degrees, producing the kinked profile that gives it its name. The angle change appears to reflect an engineering decision made during construction, possibly because the steeper angle was producing stress fractures in the interior chambers. The third pyramid, also at Dashur, was the Red Pyramid, named for the reddish limestone of its core, built at the corrected angle of 43 degrees from base to apex, and it was the first true pyramid form successfully completed in Egyptian history. 3 pyramids in a single reign, each one teaching the builders something the next one incorporated. This was institutional learning at a scale that required a bureaucratic memory larger than any individual architect. The knowledge accumulated across Sneferu's building program was inherited by his son Khufu, and Khufu used it. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, begun around 250-60 BCE, is, by any engineering or organizational measure, among the most ambitious projects in human history. Its base covers 13 acres. Its original height of 146 meters made it the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, until the spire of Lincoln Cathedral surpassed it in the 14th century CE. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, the largest of which weigh 80 tons and were transported from quarries at Aswan, 800 kilometers to the south, by a logistics operation whose scale the ancient world did not surpass until the Roman imperial building programs 15 centuries later. The limestone for the outer casing, now almost entirely stripped away by medieval builders using Giza as a quarry, came from Tura, across the river, its gleaming white surface visible for 30 kilometers across the desert. The workers' village excavated at Giza by archaeologist Mark Leaner and his team over several decades provides a portrait of the human operation behind the stone. The village housed somewhere between 10 and 20,000 workers at peak construction phases, organized into rotating gangs with names like Friends of Khufu and Endurance Gang, whose graffiti identifies their units on blocks still in situ within the pyramid's core. The bakeries at the site were producing industrial quantities of bread, enough to feed thousands of workers daily, and the brewery alongside them was producing beer at comparable scale because beer was a caloric staple of the Egyptian diet rather than an indulgence. The medical facility preserved in the archaeological record shows evidence of amputations, skull surgeries, and healed fractures, injuries consistent with construction work rather than warfare or punishment. And the fact that the workers received medical attention at state expense is among the clearest evidence that the Giza workforce was a directed labor system rather than a slave operation in the conventional sense. Khafre Khufu's son built the second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller in absolute terms, but appearing larger because it sits on higher ground, and beside it constructed the Great Sphinx, a figure carved from a natural limestone knoll, 240 feet long and 66 feet high, its face bearing what most Egyptologists identify as Khafre's own features, gazing eastward toward the rising sun. The Sphinx was not a separate monument in the original design. It was integrated into Khafre's mortuary complex, connected to his valley temple by a causeway, part of a unified architectural program in which the pyramid, the causeway, the valley temple, and the Sphinx formed a single ritual landscape through which the king's body and Ka would move in the ceremonies of death and resurrection. Menkaure Khafre's successor built the third and smallest of the Giza pyramids, its diminished scale reflecting either a philosophical modesty or, more probably, a constraint on available resources that the archaeological record does not fully explain. The Fifth Dynasty arrived with a visible shift in priorities. The pyramids of Fifth Dynasty kings are smaller than those of the Fourth, less carefully constructed, their cores built from rubble rather than solid limestone, more quickly assembled and less durable. But their mortuary temples are more elaborate, their reliefs more refined, and their inner chambers more theologically ambitious. It is inside a Fifth Dynasty pyramid, that of Unas, the last king of the dynasty at Saqqara, that the pyramid texts appear for the first time, a corpus of spells, incantations, and ritual instructions covering the pyramid's interior walls in columns of hieroglyphs, designed to guide the dead king through the dangers of the afterlife and secure his resurrection among the stars. The texts represent the oldest surviving corpus of religious literature in the world, and their appearance at this particular moment tells us something about a state beginning to invest more heavily in theological complexity than in architectural scale. The Sixth Dynasty continued and deepened the administrative patterns of the Fifth, but with a structural problem that accumulated slowly across the dynasty's century and a half. The nomarchs, the provincial governors whose authority over local irrigation, taxation, and labor supply was essential to the state's functioning, were becoming hereditary in ways that the Old Kingdom's centralized model had not originally intended. The great provincial cemeteries of the late Old Kingdom, filled with the elaborate tombs of nomarch families who had governed their nomes for generations, are evidence of a class whose local loyalty was beginning to compete with its obligation to the crown. Resources that might once have flowed to the royal building program were being retained in the provinces, financing local monuments and local administrations that owe the king theoretical allegiance but practical independence. Pepi II ascended the throne as a child and, according to the Turin King list, reigned for 94 years, a figure modern scholars generally treat as approximate but directionally credible, placing his death at a very advanced age. Whether the reign was truly 94 years or somewhat less, its effect was the same. A king who had been on the throne for longer than any living official could remember, whose court had calcified around him, whose inability or unwillingness to enforce the centralizing authority of his predecessors allowed the nomarch's accumulated power to approach something like independent sovereignty. By the time Pepi II died, the administrative machinery of the Old Kingdom was running on momentum rather than direction, and what followed his death was not a succession crisis in the ordinary sense, but a systemic failure. The First Intermediate Period, the decades between roughly 1801 and 2055 BCE, was long characterized by Egyptologists as a dark age, a time of famine, civil war, and institutional collapse following the Old Kingdom's splendor. The picture that archaeology and the literary sources now suggest is more complicated. There was genuine disruption. The royal necropolis at Saqqara was looted. The central redistributive economy contracted. The unified state fractured into competing regional powers. But the provincial culture that had been accumulating its resources for decades now expressed itself in local literary and artistic traditions of considerable vitality. The nomarchs of the First Intermediate Period governed their territories with a competence and a local legitimacy that the failing central state could not match, and the texts produced in this period, laments for the fallen kingdom alongside practical wisdom literature that assumes life goes on, show a society processing disruption without losing its cultural continuity. The Old Kingdom's pyramids remained in the landscape, enormous and unexplained to the people who came after, monuments to an ambition that the successor states would spend centuries trying to understand and eventually to match. The question of how to reunify the country, how to reassemble the centralizing authority that Khufu and Khafre had wielded, would occupy the next generation of kings, and the answer, when it came, would arrive from the south. Chapter 5: The Machinery of the Middle Kingdom. The reunification of Egypt did not come quickly, and it did not come cleanly. The First Intermediate Period lasted roughly a century and a half, during which two competing royal lines, one based at Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt, the 9th and 10th dynasties, and one based at Thebes in Upper Egypt, the 11th, fought a slow, grinding civil war for control of the valley. The Theban line eventually prevailed, and the king who completed the reunification was Mentuhotep II, whose reign of 51 years beginning around 2055 BCE is one of the most consequential and least celebrated in Egyptian history. He spent the first part of it consolidating Theban control over Upper Egypt, the middle part fighting the Heracleopolitan kings for the north, and the final decades governing a reunified country from Thebes with an administrative energy that the Old Kingdom's last generations had conspicuously lacked. Mentuhotep II's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, built against the same cliff face in western Thebes, where Hatshepsut would later construct her own, more famous monument, was architecturally innovative in ways that anticipated the new kingdom's approach to royal burial. A terraced structure integrated into the natural landscape rather than imposing upon it, combining the functions of a valley temple, a causeway, a pillared terrace, and a rock-cut tomb in a single unified complex. His statuary shows a king depicted with an intensity and solidity that differs from the serene idealism of Old Kingdom royal art, a style forged in a period of conflict rather than inherited from a tradition of unquestioned stability. The difference is subtle but legible, and it reflects the conditions of his reign honestly. The 12th dynasty, which Mentuhotep II's successors gave way to after a brief transitional reign, is the period that Egyptologists most often identify as the classical age of Egyptian culture, the moment when the language, the literature, the administrative organization, and the artistic conventions that would define Egypt for subsequent periods reached their fullest development. It began with a coup. Amenemhat I, the first king of the 12th dynasty, was almost certainly a former vizier who seized the throne from the last 11th dynasty king, and the awareness of that irregular origin shaped his entire political strategy. A king who lacked the unbroken divine lineage that legitimate succession implied had to construct legitimacy through other means, through military success, administrative competence, monumental building, and the sponsorship of literary texts that argued his case in theological and historical terms. The teaching of Amenemhat, a text purportedly composed by the king himself as advice to his son and successor Senusret I, written after his own assassination, is one of the most politically sophisticated documents from the ancient world. In it, the king counsels his son toward a vigilant solitude. Trust no one, rely on no one, keep your own counsel, because the king who sleeps beside his officials wakes to find them enemies. Whether Amenemhat actually composed the text, or whether it was written by court scribes in his name after his death to provide divine sanction for the new dynasty's continuation, is uncertain. But its tone of earned wariness feels like a document that emerged from genuine political experience rather than ceremonial convention. It was copied in Egyptian schools for centuries afterward as a model of literary style and political wisdom, which means its cynicism about loyalty and trust was transmitted to generations of Egyptian administrators as foundational professional advice. Amenemhat I moved the dynasty's capital from Thebes northward to a new city he called Ichtavi, Caesar of the Two Lands. Located near the entrance to the Fayum Depression in Middle Egypt, roughly equidistant from the Delta and Upper Egypt, and better positioned to administer the reunified country than a Theban capital had been. The move was both practical and symbolic. a new dynasty establishing itself at a new center, neither Upper nor Lower Egyptian, but, like Memphis before it, deliberately neutral ground. The Fayum itself, a large fertile depression fed by a branch of the Nile, capable of supporting agriculture on a scale that the valley proper could not match in comparable acreage, attracted 12th dynasty investment in land reclamation and irrigation that expanded the cultivable area substantially and added to the state's agricultural surplus. Senusret I, who succeeded his father and may have been co-regent during the final years of Amenemhat I's reign, extended the dynasty's military reach in both directions, southward into Nubia, where he pushed Egyptian control to the Second Cataract, and northward into the Levant, where Egyptian influence over the trading cities of Canaan was consolidated, if not yet formalized as empire. His building program at Karnak, the great temple complex at Thebes, whose expansion would continue for 1,500 years, and whose accumulated monuments represent the longest continuous building project in history, began in his reign with a white chapel of exceptional elegance, its reliefs among the finest surviving from any period of Egyptian art. The chapel was later dismantled by a New Kingdom successor, and its blocks used as fill inside a larger pylon, where they were discovered in the 20th century and painstakingly reassembled. Senusret III is the figure who most completely embodies the 12th dynasty's administrative ambition. His Nubian campaigns extended Egyptian military presence to the Third Cataract, and the fortress system he consolidated along the Second Cataract. A network of at least 17 mud brick fortresses at sites including Buin, Semna, Kuma, and Mergissa was an administrative achievement as much as a military one. Each fortress was a small state in miniature, garrisoned, provisioned, equipped with granaries and administrative offices, connected to the others by a communication system that could relay messages up and down the river. The fortresses controlled access to Nubian gold, cattle, and trade goods, and they did so with a regularity and thoroughness that converted the Cataract region from a contested frontier into a managed border. His domestic reform was equally consequential, and in some respects more radical. Senusret III dramatically curtailed the power of the nomarchs, the provincial governors whose hereditary authority had been accumulating since the late Old Kingdom, and whose independence had contributed to the first intermediate period's fragmentation. He reorganized the country's administration into 3 large departments, one for the north, one for the south, one for the head of the south, meaning the Fayum region, each governed by a council of officials who reported directly to the vizier and through the vizier to the king. The hereditary nomarchate effectively disappeared from the record after his reign. The great provincial cemeteries that had been filling with elaborate nomarch tombs for generations suddenly ceased receiving new occupants, and the administrative titles associated with hereditary provincial governance vanished from the inscriptions. Whether Senusret the Freed achieved this through direct abolition, through the gradual reassignment of powers to central appointees, or through some combination of both, the result was a centralized bureaucratic state of a kind that Egypt had not seen since the early Old Kingdom. The literature produced during the 12th dynasty reflects a cultural confidence that the first intermediate period's disruptions had, paradoxically, made possible. The story of Sinuhe, composed in the early 12th dynasty, and surviving in more manuscript copies than any other Egyptian literary text, which is itself a measure of its canonical status. Follows an official named Senue, who flees Egypt upon hearing of Amenemhat assassination, fearing his own association with the dead king will make him a target in the succession struggle. He reaches the Levant, is taken in by a Bedouin chieftain, marries the chieftain's daughter, becomes a respected figure in his adopted land, fights a duel against a local champion, and prospers, but spends his years in exile longing for Egypt with an intensity that the text renders not as sentiment, but as a physical condition, a kind of homesickness that operates at the level of identity rather than preference. The message that eventually comes from the new king, Senusrit I, inviting Sinua to return, is received by the exile as a restoration of his essential self, not merely a change of address. His return to Egypt, his reception at court, his ceremonial rebeathing and reclothing in fine linen, his reinstatement into the administrative class, the preparation of his tomb near the palace, is described with a specificity of material detail that makes it one of the most vivid accounts of Egyptian court culture from any period. The lice-ridden garments of the desert replaced by white linen, the goat skin replaced by fine oil, the hard bread of the nomad replaced by the bread and beer of the palace table, the tomb prepared and waiting, its equipment assembled by royal command. Sinua's story is not, in the end, a political document. It is a meditation on what Egypt meant to the Egyptians who lived in it, what the ordered world of the Nile Valley represented to people who understood their civilization not as one option among many, but as the correct condition of human life. Abroad, Sinue is admired and comfortable and successful. He is also, in some fundamental sense, absent from himself as much as from his country. The return is not a reward. It is a restoration of wholeness. No other text from the ancient world makes the case for Egyptian civilization as eloquently from the inside, which is perhaps why the scribal schools copied it for centuries, and why modern readers who encounter it still find its homesickness comprehensible across the distance of 4,000 years. The Middle Kingdom's stability proved sustainable for several generations after Senusret III, the 12th dynasty running its course with a regularity that the sources record without drama. The 13th dynasty that followed was longer in duration, but less stable in composition. A rapid succession of kings, many of whom reigned for only a few years, suggesting either high mortality or political instability at the royal level, even as the administrative bureaucracy Senusret III had built continued functioning below them with a bureaucratic inertia that kept the state operational. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the central government's grip on the delta weakened. The eastern delta in particular, open to the Sinai, accessible from the Levant, already home to significant populations of West Asian origin who had been settling there throughout the Middle Kingdom, began developing its own political dynamic, one that the 13th dynasty's weakened kings were not in a position to manage. The story of how that weakness became an occupation, and how the occupation eventually forged the instrument of its own expulsion, was already beginning in the Delta marshes while Thebes still sent its officials north with their papyrus rolls and their administrative authority. The people who would become the Hyksos were not yet kings. They were settlers, traders, craftsmen, soldiers, a gradual presence in the eastern delta that the Egyptian state had accommodated for generations without fully understanding what it was accommodating. Chapter 6: The Strangers in the Delta. The eastern delta was always a different kind of Egypt. Where the valley to the south was narrow and enclosed, the river running between desert scarps that left only a few kilometers of cultivable land on either side. The delta was broad, low, wet, and multiple. The Nile divided into 7 major channels as it spread toward the Mediterranean, creating a landscape of marshland, reed beds, shallow lakes, and fertile islands that was as unlike the valley as a coastline is unlike a corridor. It faced outward, toward the sea, toward the Sinai, toward the Levantine coast that was only a short sail or a few days' walk beyond the eastern branch of the river. People moved through it more easily than they moved through the valley, and the populations that settled its eastern margins were more mixed, more transient, and more connected to the wider world of the Near East than the farmers of Upper Egypt, who lived in a landscape that geography had made almost self-contained. The people the Egyptians called Hatshepsut, rulers of foreign lands, a phrase that the Greeks would eventually compress into Hyksos, did not arrive in Egypt as an invading army. The later Egyptian sources, written after their expulsion, describe them as conquerors who swept in from the east and seized the country by force, and that account served the political purposes of the New Kingdom kings who commissioned it. The archaeology of Avaris, the Hyksos capital in the eastern delta, excavated over decades by the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Betak at the site of modern Tel El Daba, tells a more gradual story. The site shows a continuous occupation that begins in the Middle Kingdom with a settlement of West Asian character, grows steadily through the Second Intermediate Period, and eventually develops into a city of substantial size and complexity, whose material culture is a mixture of Egyptian and Levantine elements, so thoroughly interwoven that the categories themselves begin to seem inadequate. The Hyksos who eventually ruled as the 15th dynasty were not recent arrivals. They were the political leadership of a community that had been established in the Delta for generations, accumulating local authority as the 13th dynasty's central government weakened and the mechanisms of Egyptian state control in the north contracted. Their rise to royal power was less an invasion than a consolidation, the moment when a long-established local dominance formalized itself as kingship. They adopted Egyptian royal titles, used the cartouche, built in the Egyptian style, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own, and conducted their administration in the Egyptian language. The Hyksos king Apepi, the most prominent of the 15th dynasty rulers, commissioned copies of Egyptian mathematical and medical texts, and the Rhind mathematical papyrus, one of the most important documents in the history of mathematics, was copied during his reign from a Middle Kingdom original. These were not the acts of a foreign occupier contemptuous of the culture it had displaced. They were the acts of a dynasty that understood Egyptian legitimacy and worked, in its own way, to claim it. What the Hyksos brought with them from the Levantine world was militarily transformative. The composite bow, shorter than the Egyptian simple bow but far more powerful, built from layers of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together to store and release energy that a wooden bow of comparable size could not approach, extended the effective range of an archer significantly beyond what Egyptian forces could match with their existing equipment. The horse and chariot arrived in Egypt through the Hyksos connection, and the chariot in particular was a military technology without precedent in the Nile Valley, a light, fast platform from which archers could engage enemy forces at range and then withdraw before infantry could close with them, requiring a combined arms response that Egyptian military organization had not previously developed. The vertical loom, which the Hyksos also introduced, improved Egyptian textile production. New bronze casting techniques came with them. The Hyksos interlude was, among other things, a forced technology transfer, and the new kingdom that eventually expelled them would be equipped with everything the Hyksos had taught. The parallel Theban kingdom of the 17th dynasty continued in the south throughout the Hyksos period, governing Upper Egypt from Thebes with the full pharaonic apparatus, the titles, the temples, the administrative structure, while acknowledging, at least implicitly, the Hyksos control of the north. The relationship between the two kingdoms was not consistently hostile. For much of the Second Intermediate Period, it appears to have been a kind of uneasy coexistence, with trade continuing along the river and the more acute military confrontation concentrated in the zone of contact around Middle Egypt. A letter preserved in a later source, its authenticity debated but its details historically plausible, describes the Hyksos king Apipi sending a complaint to the Theban king Seqenri Tau II about the noise of hippopotamuses at Thebes disturbing his sleep in Avaris, 800 kilometers to the north. The absurdity of the complaint was probably its point, a diplomatic provocation designed to force a response, to test whether Thebes was still capable of asserting itself, or whether it would absorb the insult in silence. Seqenenre Tau Siken did not absorb it in silence. The evidence of what followed is written on his mummy, which was discovered in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahri in 1881 and has been studied repeatedly in the century and a half since. His skull bears wounds from multiple weapons, a battle axe blow above the left eye, a spear or lance thrust below the left ear, a dagger or sword strike to the right side of the forehead, delivered from different angles and with different instruments, suggesting either that he was attacked by multiple assailants simultaneously or that he was struck, fell, and was struck again while down. The wounds were not treated. There is no evidence of the bone healing that would indicate he survived long after receiving them. A 2021 CT scan analysis suggested that some of the wounds were delivered from above while he was restrained or already prone, raising the possibility that he was captured and executed rather than simply killed in the field, though the evidence permits more than one interpretation. What the mummy establishes beyond reasonable doubt is that Seqenri Tau II died violently, at a relatively young age, in circumstances consistent with combat against the Hyksos. He may have died in battle. He may have been captured and killed afterward. He may have fallen in one engagement and his body recovered from the field in a condition that precluded the usual embalming preparations, which would explain the somewhat hasty quality of his mummification. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the man who appears to have provoked or accepted open conflict with the Hyksos paid for that decision with his life, and the cause passed to his sons. Kamose, his elder son and successor, took up the campaign with an aggression that the surviving inscriptions record in unusual detail. Two stelae set up at Karnak describe his campaigns in a voice that carries genuine military urgency beneath its formulaic pharaonic rhetoric. He pushed north from Thebes, recaptured Middle Egypt from the Hyksos and penetrated as far as the environs of Avaris itself, before being compelled to withdraw. His campaign also intercepted a Hyksos messenger carrying a letter to the ruler of Kush, the Nubian kingdom to the south, proposing an alliance against Thebes, a two-front threat that Kamos's campaign had preempted by moving fast enough to catch the messenger before the letter reached its destination. The interception was a strategic success, and Kamos recorded it with evident satisfaction. He did not live to complete what he had begun. His reign lasted only 3 years from the beginning of his active campaigns, and whether he died of illness or in combat, the sources do not specify. The task fell to his younger brother, a boy who was probably no more than 10 years old when Kamos died, and who would spend the first years of his reign under his mother Ahotep's regency. His name was Ahmose. He would finish what his father and brother had started, and what he built on the far side of that completion would be the most powerful Egyptian state in history. Chapter 7: The Kingdom Renewed. Ahmose I came to full power in his mid-teens, after years of regency under his mother Ahotep, a woman whose own military decorations, found buried with her, include the Gold of Valor, an honor awarded for battlefield courage, suggesting that the regency period was not politically passive, and that the queen who held it was not a ceremonial figure. By the time Ahmose took command of the campaign his father and brother had begun, he inherited both the military momentum Kamos had generated and the strategic clarity that momentum required to become a conclusion. The siege of Avaris, the Hyksos capital, was the central military event of his reign, and though the details of how it fell are not preserved in any continuous Egyptian account, the city's destruction level in the archaeological record at Tel el-Dabah marks the transition with unambiguous finality. Avaris was taken. The Hyksos dynasty that had ruled the north for roughly a century was expelled. The 15th dynasty ended not with a negotiated settlement, but with a pursuit, Ahmose following the retreating Hyksos forces into the southern Levant and besieging them at Sharuan, a fortified city in the Negev, for 3 years before that stronghold too fell. The account of these campaigns that survives in the most human detail is not a royal inscription. It is a tomb autobiography, a genre in which Egyptian officials recorded their careers on the walls of their burial chambers for the benefit of visitors and for the gods who would judge their lives. The official in question was a soldier from the town of Nekev named Ahmose son of Abana, whose career spanned the reigns of several kings, and whose account of the Avaris campaign and its aftermath is the closest thing to an eyewitness military narrative that the entire New Kingdom has left behind. He describes fighting in the water, the canal-threaded landscape around Avaris that made the siege as much a naval operation as a land campaign, and receiving gold as a reward for taking prisoners in the king's sight. He records each gold award, each captured hand presented to the accounting officers, each promotion, with the precision of a man who understood that his valor was a currency and that its record in stone would serve his memory and his descendants. Gold of valor, 3 times. Slaves given to him. Land granted. His account is the autobiography of a professional soldier who was very good at his work and wanted posterity to know it. The expulsion of the Hyksos solved the immediate military problem and created an immediate ideological one. A dynasty that had come to power by driving out foreign occupiers needed to explain in theological terms what that victory meant and what obligations it imposed. The answer the new kingdom developed was imperial. The Hyksos invasion had demonstrated that Egypt's security depended on the subjugation of its neighbors, that the buffer of a politically organized frontier was insufficient, and that genuine safety required Egyptian military presence far beyond the traditional boundaries of the two lands. This argument that attack was the necessary form of defense, that the pharaoh's cosmic duty to maintain order required the projection of Egyptian power into the disordered world beyond Egypt's borders, became the foundational ideology of New Kingdom expansion, and it was remarkably durable. Every major New Kingdom military campaign for the next 4 centuries was conducted, in its official justification, as an extension of Amos's logic. The administrative apparatus that Amos and his successors built to support that expansion was qualitatively different from the Middle Kingdom state it replaced. The army was reorganized as a professional standing force rather than a levy assembled for specific campaigns, divisions named after the great gods, Amun, Ra, Ptah, Set, each containing several thousand infantry and chariot troops, capable of sustained operations far from the Nile Valley. The officer class became a distinct social group with its own career path, its own system of rewards and promotions, its own relationship to the crown that was separate from and parallel to the civil bureaucracy. Veterans received land grants in the Nile Valley that gave them a stake in the agricultural economy, the same economy that funded the campaigns, and the military aristocracy that developed from this arrangement would eventually become one of the most powerful social forces in the New Kingdom state. The Amun priesthood at Karnak grew alongside the military apparatus, and the relationship between the two is one of the defining structural features of the New Kingdom. Ahmose and his successors lavished the Temple of Amun with donations of land, cattle, gold, and captive labor from their campaigns, and Amun, the hidden god of Thebes, who had been the patron deity of the Theban dynasty that expelled the Hyksos, became the preeminent deity of the Egyptian pantheon, his priesthood accumulating institutional wealth that would eventually make it a power capable of rivaling the crown itself. By the end of the New Kingdom, the Amun Temple at Karnak controlled roughly a third of Egypt's cultivable land and a comparable fraction of its cattle, a landholding that made it, in economic terms, something close to a state within the state. Thutmose I, the third king of the 18th dynasty, pushed Egyptian military reach to its greatest extent yet. His Nubian campaign drove south to the Fourth Cataract, further than any previous Egyptian king had penetrated, and his Levantine campaign crossed the Euphrates River, bringing him into contact with the Mitanni kingdom of northern Mesopotamia and planting a victory stele on the Euphrates bank in a gesture whose symbolic audacity was as important as its military significance. No Egyptian king had reached the Euphrates before. The stele announced to anyone who encountered it in that distant landscape that the Egyptian world now extended to the edges of the known one. It was Thutmose I who made the decision that would determine the topography of Egyptian royal burial for the next 5 centuries. Abandoning the pyramid tradition, which had made the location of the royal tomb unmistakably obvious and had consequently failed to protect its contents from robbers in the long centuries of the Middle Kingdom and the First Intermediate Period, he chose instead to cut his tomb into the living rock of a remote desert valley in the cliffs west of Thebes. The valley, known today as the Valley of the Kings, was selected with care. It was hidden from the Nile floodplain by a natural ridge of limestone, whose peak, a pyramidal peak, as if the landscape itself had provided the traditional form in natural stone, rose above the valley and gave it both a visual connection to the pyramid tradition and a practical isolation from it. Access was difficult. The valley was narrow, easily guarded, far from settled areas. If secrecy and concealment could protect a royal burial, this was where secrecy and concealment had the best chance of working. The architect who designed Thutmose I's tomb was Ineni, who recorded in his own autobiography that he supervised the cutting of the tomb alone, no one seeing and no one hearing, a statement that almost certainly means no one outside the trusted royal workforce, rather than a literal solitary excavation, but whose phrasing reflects the awareness that concealment was the tomb's primary defense. Inani's autobiography is another of those documents in which a New Kingdom official quietly reveals, in the act of commemorating his own achievement, something about how the Egyptian state actually worked, through trusted specialists whose discretion was as valued as their technical skill, whose loyalty to the crown was a professional as much as a personal commitment. Thutmose II, who followed his father after a relatively brief reign, is a somewhat shadowy figure. His mummy shows a man who died in his 30s, his body bearing the marks of a skin disease, his military campaigns more modest than his father's. His significance in the dynastic sequence is largely structural. He fathered, with a secondary wife, a son who would become one of Egypt's greatest military kings, and he left that son too young to rule independently when he died. The regency that followed, the arrangements made for a child king who was not yet capable of exercising royal authority, produced one of the most remarkable reigns in Egyptian history, not because of the child who nominally held the throne, but because of the woman who governed beside him and eventually above him. She had been Thutmose II's principal wife. She was the daughter of Thutmose IV. Her name was Hatshepsut, and she had watched the machinery of pharaonic power operate from close proximity her entire life. When the regency began, she understood that machinery better than almost anyone alive, and she had already begun to consider what it might be made to do. Chapter 8: The Female Pharaoh. Egyptian tradition was not, in principle, hostile to female power. The queen occupied a defined and theologically significant role in the royal apparatus. She was the divine consort, the mother of the heir, the vessel through which the royal bloodline passed from one generation to the next, and her position carried genuine institutional weight rather than merely ceremonial function. Women of the royal family could serve as regents, as great royal wives whose influence on policy was real, if rarely documented, as God's wives of Amun, whose religious authority at Karnak gave them a standing independent of any male relative. The tradition had produced, at the end of the 12th dynasty, a female king named Sobek Neferu, who ruled for approximately 4 years and whose existence in the royal record, complete with male titulary, including the epithet son of Ra, adapted without apparent anxiety, demonstrates that the category of female pharaoh was available within the system's logic, even if it had not been frequently used. Hatshepsut began her public role as regent for the child king Thutmose III in the conventional way. She governed, she administered, she appeared in the ceremonial contexts that required a royal presence, and she did so initially with the titles and iconography appropriate to a queen regent rather than a king. The transition, the moment when she claimed the full 5-part royal titulary, adopted the male iconography of the smiting pharaoh, had herself depicted in statuary wearing the double crown and the false beard, happened gradually, probably between years 2 and 7 of Thutmose III's nominal reign, and its precise mechanics remain somewhat opaque because the monuments that might have documented the transition were later systematically altered. What is clear is that by the middle of her regency, Hatshepsut was not regent in any practical sense. She was pharaoh, and Thutmose III was her co-ruler in a subordinate position, performing military and ceremonial functions appropriate to a junior king while she governed. The ideological justification she constructed for this unprecedented position drew on existing theological resources with considerable sophistication. The reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri include a scene depicting the god Amun visiting her mother Amos in the guise of Thutmose I, and the divine conception that followed. Hatshepsut, presented as the daughter of Amun himself, her kingship ordained before her birth, is the same divine birth narrative that male pharaohs had used for generations. She was not inventing a new legitimation, but applying an existing one to a situation it had not previously been required to cover, and the application was, in its own terms, theologically coherent. If the pharaoh's authority derived from divine parentage, and if divine parentage could be established for a female claimant, the gender of the claimant was a secondary consideration. The theology was not designed to exclude women. It was simply designed for a world in which excluding them had rarely been necessary. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is among the finest architectural achievements of the ancient world by any standard of assessment. Built against the natural amphitheater of the western Theban cliffs, the same cliff face where Mentuhotep II had built his own mortuary complex 4 centuries earlier, which Hatshepsut's architects studied and responded to. It rises in 3 colonnaded terraces connected by ramps, its horizontal lines playing against the vertical drama of the limestone escarpment behind it, with a precision that suggests the architects understood the site as carefully as any modern landscape designer. The limestone columns of its porticos, the painted reliefs covering its interior walls, the garden terraces where myrrh trees transplanted from Punt were grown in soil brought with them from that distant country. All of it together constituted a monument whose ambition was legible in every proportional decision its builders made. The Punt expedition that those myrrh trees commemorated was the commercial achievement Hatshepsut's reign remembered most explicitly. Punt, a land somewhere along the Red Sea coast, probably in the region of modern Eritrea, Somalia, or Djibouti, whose precise location remains debated, was a source of luxury goods that Egypt had been trading with since the Old Kingdom and had not reached in several generations before Hatshepsut's reign. The expedition she dispatched, sometime around year 9 of her reign, comprised 5 large ships that sailed south from a Red Sea port and returned laden with myrrh trees in soil filled baskets, dried myrrh resin, ebony logs, ivory, animal skins, live animals including baboons, and quantities of gold and electrum. The Deir el-Bahari reliefs depicting the expedition are among the most detailed commercial records from the ancient world. The Puntite chieftain Parehu and his wife, whose pronounced stetopigia the Egyptian artists rendered with an ethnographic specificity unusual in royal monument decoration, are shown receiving the Egyptian delegation and offering their goods in a scene whose informality is striking by the conventions of official Egyptian art. The myrrh trees were transplanted in their soil baskets along the terraced gardens of Deir el-Bahari, kept alive by watering arrangements whose maintenance required ongoing horticultural attention. An exotic garden at the heart of a mortuary complex, growing plants that had been carried by ship from a country most Egyptians would never see. The trees were not merely decorative. Myrrh resin was an essential component of temple incense, of embalming preparations, of the ointments used in royal and divine ceremonies, and importing the trees themselves rather than only their resin gave Egypt a domestic supply of a material that had previously been entirely dependent on foreign trade. The expedition was, among other things, an import substitution strategy conducted at monumental scale. Senenmut, Hatshepsut's chief steward, the overseer of all works of the king, the tutor of her daughter Neferura, and the architect or co-architect of Deir el-Bahari, was the most powerful non-royal official of her reign and one of the most intriguing figures in the New Kingdom record. He accumulated titles at a rate that suggests either extraordinary competence or extraordinary access to royal favor, and the graffiti found near Deir el-Bahari, crude drawings of a male figure in an intimate posture with a female figure wearing the double crown, represent the contemporary gossip about the nature of that favor rendered in the oldest surviving political cartoons. Whether the relationship they imply was real, imagined, or deliberately circulated by Senenmut's enemies is impossible to determine. His tomb, cut into the Theban hillside near Deir el-Bahari, has a ceiling covered in astronomical charts, the earliest astronomical ceiling known from any Egyptian private tomb, which reflects both his technical sophistication and the scale of resources he commanded as the most senior official of the most powerful ruler of his day. Hatshepsut's 2 obelisks at Karnak, the tallest obelisks ever erected in Egypt at the time of their construction, their upper portions originally sheathed in electrum that caught the morning sun and was visible from across the river, were accompanied by an inscription in which she recorded, with characteristic directness, her awareness that later generations might doubt what she had accomplished. She addressed those doubters across time from the stone itself, telling them that what they saw was real and that she had done it, asking them not to say of her works that she had not done what she said. The inscription has a quality that is unusual in royal monument texts, a self-consciousness about its own future reception, a recognition that the claim being made was extraordinary, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary assertion. She was right to anticipate doubt. Within 2 decades of her death, the doubt would be imposed not by skepticism, but by deliberate erasure. Thutmose III, who had been co-ruler throughout Hatshepsut's reign and who assumed sole kingship after her death around 1458 BCE, waited approximately 20 years before beginning the campaign of erasure that would occupy the late years of his reign. The images of Hatshepsut on monument walls were chiseled out, her cartouches replaced with those of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, or Thutmose III himself, her statuary dismantled and buried in a pit near Deir el-Bahri, where it was found in the 20th century and eventually reassembled into a portrait of startling beauty and variety. The motive for the erasure has been debated at length. The timing, 2 decades after her death, when anyone who had served her would be elderly or dead, argues against personal animus. The most compelling explanation that the evidence supports is dynastic. Thutmose III, concerned with the legitimacy of the succession he intended for his own son, wanted to remove from the visible record any evidence that a female king had intervened in the sequence between Thutmose I and himself. The erasure was not about Hatshepsut personally. It was about the precedent her existence represented and the threat that precedent posed to a succession he needed to appear unambiguous. The irony of the erasure is that it failed on its own terms. Hatshepsut's memory was not extinguished. It was buried, which is a different thing, and burial, as Egypt of all civilizations should have known, is not the same as ending. The reign that followed hers, unencumbered by her presence, but equipped with the administrative and military apparatus she had maintained and extended, would carry Egyptian power to its furthest reach. Thutmose III, patient, systematic, militarily gifted in ways the record documents with unusual specificity, was about to become the pharaoh who built the empire that her reign had made possible. Chapter 9: The God Who Was Wrong. Amenhotep III inherited an empire at its apex. The 18th dynasty had spent a century and a half building the military, diplomatic, and economic architecture of Egyptian imperial power, and by the time Amenhotep III ascended the throne around 1388 BCE, that architecture was functioning with a smoothness that allowed the king to govern from a position of extraordinary luxury rather than extraordinary exertion. His reign of roughly 38 years was, by any measure of material culture, the most opulent in Egyptian history. He built on a scale that had not been seen since the Old Kingdom. His mortuary temple on the West Bank at Thebes was the largest ever constructed, its entrance flanked by 2 seated colossi of quartzite that still stand 60 feet high in the Theban plain, known to the Greeks as the Colossi of Memnon. He built a palace at Malkata whose mud brick foundations cover an area of several city blocks. He celebrated 3 said festivals. The royal jubilee ceremony traditionally held after 30 years of reign, and the records of those celebrations give an impression of a court culture of staggering wealth, whose diplomatic connections extended from Nubia to Mesopotamia, and whose appetite for luxury goods, exotic animals, and foreign wives was met by the tribute and trade flows of an empire that had not yet begun to fray. The Amarna Letters, a diplomatic archive of clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, discovered at the site of Akhenaten's capital in 1887, preserve the correspondence of this period and its successor with an intimacy that no other documentary source from the ancient Near East matches. The letters include communications between the Egyptian court and the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, Elashia, and the vassal rulers of Canaan and Syria, and their content ranges from formal treaty language to complaints about the inadequacy of Egyptian gold shipments to requests for Egyptian physicians and Egyptian statues. The Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil writes to Amenhotep III with a directness that suggests the two men understood each other as equals conducting business. He wants Egyptian gold. He is considering giving his daughter in marriage to the Egyptian court. He is annoyed that Egyptian envoys have not brought adequate gifts. The correspondence is the record of a diplomatic world in which Egypt was the dominant but not the unchallenged power, and in which the maintenance of that dominance required constant attention to the flow of gifts, letters, marriages, and military commitments that held the system together. Amenhotep III's son, who ascended the throne as Amenhotep IV, and within the first years of his reign renamed himself Akhenaten, servant of the Aten, inherited all of that and chose to dismantle most of it. The Aten was not a new deity. The sun disk had been an element of Egyptian solar theology for centuries, and Amenhotep III had shown a particular devotion to solar symbolism in the later years of his reign. What Akhenaten did was take that existing element and elevate it to a position of exclusive divine authority, suppressing the traditional pantheon, closing temples, redirecting their revenues, erasing the names of gods from monument walls with the same systematic thoroughness that Thutmose III had applied to Hatshepsut's cartouches, and establishing a new religious order in which the Aten was the sole divine power, and the royal family was its sole earthly intermediary. The theological implications of this were radical in ways that the Egyptian tradition had not previously confronted. The traditional pantheon was not merely a collection of supernatural beings. It was the administrative and economic infrastructure of the Egyptian state. The temples of Amun, Ptah, Ra, Osiris, and the dozens of other deities held land, employed priests, fed redistribution networks, maintained granaries, and administered the festivals that organized the agricultural and social calendar of every community in Egypt. To suppress the temples was not a spiritual act with incidental administrative consequences. It was an administrative act of the first order, concentrating in the crown and its new cult the revenues and the institutional authority that had previously been distributed across a complex of religious institutions with their own hierarchies, their own loyalties, and their own political weight. The Amun priesthood alone, by the 18th dynasty, controlled resources whose scale made it the most powerful institutional actor in Egypt after the crown. Akhenaten's revolution, whatever its theological sincerity, had the effect of breaking that power entirely. He built his new capital on a stretch of virgin desert cliff in Middle Egypt, on land that belonged to no existing god or existing temple, a site now called Amarna, known in antiquity as Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. The city rose with remarkable speed, its administrative buildings, temples, royal palace, and residential quarters constructed within a few years of the site's selection, its boundaries marked by a series of boundary stelae inscribed with the king's oath, never to expand the city beyond its chosen limits, and never to leave it. The stelae record an unusual document, a royal oath of place, a king binding himself to a particular geography, as if the city itself were a covenant. Whether the oath reflected religious conviction, political strategy, or a combination that the ancient world did not distinguish between the way modern categories might require, the result was a capital city built from nothing and occupied for perhaps 15 years before being abandoned with equal speed. The art produced at Amarna is unlike anything else in the Egyptian record. The royal family is depicted with a physical naturalism. Elongated skulls, soft abdomens, wide hips, intimate domestic scenes of the king and queen dandling their daughters, that breaks with the idealized conventions of traditional Egyptian royal art so completely that early scholars, encountering it in the 19th century, initially doubted whether the figures depicted were Egyptian at all. Nefertiti, whose limestone bust in the Berlin Museum is among the most recognized images from the ancient world, appears in the Amarna reliefs as a figure of genuine political weight, depicted wearing the blue crown that was a military and royal symbol, shown smiting enemies in the traditional pharaonic posture, named in inscriptions with an Eton name of her own. Her role in the Amarna court extended beyond the ceremonial. Whether she served, in the final years of Akhenaten's reign, as a co-ruler or even as a successor king under a different name, is a question the evidence raises without definitively answering. The theological document at the center of the Amarna Revolution is the great hymn to the Aten, composed in the king's name and inscribed on the tomb wall of the official A at Amarna. It is a poem of genuine literary power, its description of the sun's daily course, its celebration of creation and sustenance, its vision of the Aten as the source of all life and all distinction between peoples, that stands among the finest religious poetry of the ancient world. Scholars have noted since the 19th century its resemblance to Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible, which shares its imagery of the sun rising to send creatures to their work, of darkness retreating before the light, of the earth renewed by divine provision. Whether the resemblance reflects direct influence, the Amarna period and the period of Israelite settlement in Canaan overlap in ways that make contact possible, or independent development of shared Near Eastern religious imagery remains genuinely uncertain. The comparison is worth noting not to resolve a question, but to observe that the theological imagination of the Amarna court was operating at a level sophisticated enough to produce language that would still resonate in a different tradition centuries later. Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE after 17 years of reign, and the court that had built itself around his theology began to dissolve almost immediately. A brief and murky succession, possibly including a reign by Nefertiti under the name Nefer-Neferu-ten, possibly including a very short reign by another figure named Smenkhkare, preceded the accession of a child king whose original name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, and who was probably Akhenaten's son by a secondary wife. He was perhaps 9 years old when he became king, and the officials who governed during his minority, particularly the elderly courtier whose tomb carried the hymn to the Aten, and Horemheb, the general who commanded the army, made the decision, early in his reign, to undo what Akhenaten had done. The child king's name was changed to Tutankhamun, replacing the Aten with Amun. The court returned to Memphis. The Amun temples were reopened, their revenues restored, their priesthoods reinstated. The restoration decree issued in Tutankhamun's name describes the temples as having fallen into ruin, their sanctuaries overgrown, their festivals abandoned, the gods having turned their backs on Egypt, the language of a state acknowledging that something had gone very wrong and committing to repair it. Tutankhamun died at approximately 19 years of age, his small body showing evidence of malaria and a fractured leg that may have contributed to his death. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings filled with the extraordinary objects that Howard Carter would find intact in 1922 and that would make his name in the modern world the most recognizable of all the pharaohs, despite the brevity and political subordination of his actual reign. A ruled briefly after him. Horemheb ruled longer, and more consequentially, he systematically dismantled what remained of the Amarna period's physical and administrative legacy, appropriating Tutankhamun's restoration monuments into his own name, demolishing the buildings of Akhetaten, erasing Akhenaten's name from the king lists so thoroughly that the Amarna period was effectively removed from the official sequence of Egyptian history. Future king lists would jump from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, as if the intervening decades had not occurred. The erasure was more complete in its way than anything Thutmose III had managed with Hatshepsut, because what was being erased was not a person but a period, not a reign but a revolution, and the people doing the erasing had strong institutional reasons to ensure that nothing of it survived to serve as a precedent. Horemheb died without an heir of his own blood and left the throne to his military colleague Ramesses, an elderly general from the Delta whose family had served in the army for generations and who would found a dynasty that carried Egypt through its last great imperial phase. The Ramesside age was beginning, and with it the most famous name in Egyptian history. Chapter 10: The Great Name and Its Aftermath. Ramesses I was old when he became king and reigned for less than 2 years, which makes him historically significant primarily as the founder of a dynasty rather than as an architect of its character. That work fell to his son Seti I, who came to the throne around 1294 BCE with the military competence and administrative energy that the post-Amarna restoration had demanded but not yet fully delivered. Seti I campaigned in the Levant with a systematic thoroughness that Horemheb had begun and that the dynasty's ideology required. The Hyksos memory still functioned as a political argument for Egyptian presence beyond its borders, and the Levantine city-states that had drifted toward Hittite influence during the Amarna period's diplomatic neglect needed to be reminded of their obligations. His campaigns in Canaan, his engagement with the Hittites in Syria, and his consolidation of the Nubian frontier gave the 19th dynasty its military credibility before his son arrived to spend it on something larger. Seti I's building program ran alongside his military campaigns with a parallel ambition. The temple at Abydos, the sacred site of Osiris, the oldest royal burial ground in Egypt, a place whose religious significance had been continuous since the first dynasty, received under CDI one of the finest structures of the entire New Kingdom, a seven-chapel temple whose painted reliefs are among the best preserved and most accomplished in the Egyptian record. Their colors still vivid after 3,000 years, their draftsmanship operating at a level of refinement that the later Ramesside temples, for all their scale, rarely matched. The Abydos king list inscribed within it, a sequence of cartouches recording the names of Seti Ara's predecessors in the royal line, used by priests to perform the mortuary offerings due to each, is one of the primary documents for reconstructing the dynastic sequence, its omissions as informative as its inclusions. Akhenaten, Smenkare, Neferuaten, Tutankhamun, and I are all absent. The official memory of the Amarna period's erasure maintained in the very act of honoring the legitimate dead. Ramesses II ascended the throne around 1279 BCE at perhaps 25 years of age and proceeded to occupy it for 66 years, the longest reign of any Egyptian king whose dates can be established with reasonable confidence, and a reign whose sheer duration transformed it into something more than a political administration. Ramesses II became, over those decades, a monument to himself while still living, the builder of Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, the dedicator of colossal statues at every major temple in Egypt, the inscriber of his own name onto monuments his predecessors had built with a thoroughness that subsequent historians found both impressive and exasperating. He fathered, by various estimates, somewhere between 45 and over 100 children by multiple wives and concubines. He outlived a dozen of his sons. His mummy, examined in the 19th century and treated in Paris in the 1970s for a fungal infection that was degrading its tissues, shows a man of considerable height who suffered from severe arthritis in his later years, whose red hair had been dyed with henna, and who was probably in his 90s when he died. A lifespan so extraordinary that the officials who survived him into the following reign had known no other pharaoh. The event that defined his military reputation and shaped his propaganda for the rest of his reign was a battle he nearly lost. The confrontation with the Hittite forces of Muwatalli II at Kadesh, on the Orontes River in what is now western Syria, in the 5th year of Ramesses II's reign, around 1274 BCE, began as a near disaster. Egyptian intelligence had been deceived by Hittite agents posing as deserters who reported the Hittite army far to the north, when in fact it was concealed behind the city of Kadesh and waiting. The division of Amun, in which Ramesses was traveling, had advanced ahead of the other Egyptian divisions and was caught in the open by a Hittite chariot force that swept through the exposed flank and came close to destroying the Egyptian camp. The accounts of the battle, inscribed on the walls of 5 major Egyptian temples, including Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, and Abydos, describe Ramesses calling on Amun and fighting his way out of the encirclement with his personal guard while the rest of his army regrouped. Whether this account is accurate in its details or a propagandistic reconstruction of a chaotic situation cannot be fully determined, but the physical evidence of the battle, the tactical stalemate, the failure of either side to destroy the other, The withdrawal of both armies from the field suggests that what Ramesses depicted as a personal triumph was, in strategic terms, an inconclusive engagement that both sides claimed as a victory without either achieving one. The treaty that concluded the Kadesh conflict did not come immediately. It came 16 years later, after years of continued campaigning and diplomatic negotiation between Ramesses II and the new Hittite king Hattusili III, who had come to power through his own internal succession crisis and who had strong reasons to stabilize his western frontier. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty of approximately 1259 BCE is the earliest surviving international peace treaty in the historical record. Its text preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs on the walls of Karnak and the Ramesseum, and in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets found at the Hittite capital Hattusa, the two versions differing in their framing while agreeing in their substance. It established recognized borders, provided for the mutual extradition of political refugees, committed each party to the defense of the other against internal or external threats, and was sealed by the marriage of a Hittite princess to Ramesses II, an event that Ramesses commemorated on his temple walls with characteristic scale. The treaty held. For the remainder of both kings' reigns, the Egyptian-Hittite frontier was peaceful, which is a diplomatic achievement more historically significant than any of the military campaigns it replaced. Abu Simbel, the great rock-cut temple that Ramesses II commissioned in Nubia, its facade dominated by four seated colossi of the king, each 20 meters high, its interior penetrating 60 meters into the sandstone cliff, was oriented with a precision that still functions. Twice a year, on dates that ancient astronomical calculation placed at significant points in the royal calendar, the rising sun enters the temple's entrance and illuminates the statues of the gods in the innermost sanctuary, leaving only the statue of Ptah, a god of darkness and creation, in permanent shadow. When the temple was moved in the 1960s to save it from the rising waters of the Aswan High Dam Reservoir, the engineers who relocated it worked to preserve this solar alignment, and it still functions as designed. The monument is a clock as well as a temple, and the fact that its mechanism still works after 3,000 years is one of the more quietly remarkable things the ancient world has left behind. The later decades of Ramesses II's reign were outwardly stable and inwardly contracting. The king who had campaigned across the Levant in his youth spent his final decades at Ramesses, his delta capital, surrounded by an increasingly aging court whose institutional memory was becoming a substitute for institutional energy. The empire he had inherited and extended was maintained rather than expanded, its borders held by the treaty system and the garrisons that protected them, its administration functioning through the bureaucratic inertia of a well-established state whose momentum was still considerable even as the force generating it declined. His son and successor Meremta inherited the empire and faced, early in his reign, the first significant pressure from the Sea Peoples, the confederation of migrating groups from the Aegean and Anatolian worlds whose movements were destabilizing the Eastern Mediterranean world with an effect that the inscriptions of the period describe in terms of comprehensive disruption. The Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's peer and treaty partner for half a century, collapsed under this pressure sometime around 1180 BCE, its capital sacked, its administrative network dissolved, its king lists ending abruptly. The Levantine trading cities that had sustained the Bronze Age commercial network, Ugarit, Megiddo, Hazor, were destroyed within a generation of each other. Egypt alone among the great powers of the late Bronze Age survived, and its survival was not inevitable. Ramesses III, the second king of the 20th dynasty and the last pharaoh to exercise genuine imperial authority, fought the Sea Peoples in a series of engagements around 1077 BCE, whose scale and significance he commemorated on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in reliefs of unusual documentary specificity. The land battle scenes show Egyptian infantry and chariot forces engaging mixed groups of warriors whose distinctive equipment, feathered headdresses, round shields, long swords, distinguishes them from any enemy Egypt had previously depicted. The naval battle scene, the earliest representation of a sea battle in the historical record, shows Egyptian archers standing on the shore and in boats engaging enemy vessels whose crews are thrown into the water as the Egyptian forces close with them. The Sea Peoples were stopped at Egypt's borders, their migrating populations settled or dispersed, their military capacity broken by the Medinet Habu engagements. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse that destroyed its neighbors, but survival and prosperity are different conditions, and the 20th dynasty that followed Ramesses III demonstrated the difference across a succession of 8 more kings, all bearing the name Ramesses, a dynastic naming convention that reflected the founder's prestige while failing to reproduce his capabilities. The state's resources contracted. The payments to the royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina fell into arrears, producing the first recorded labor strikes in history, the workers sitting down on the wrong side of the necropolis wall and refusing to work until their grain rations were delivered. The high priests of Amun at Thebes accumulated authority that the weakening crown could no longer effectively check. Provincial governors acted with increasing autonomy. The end of Ramesses III's reign carried its own particular darkness. The Harem Conspiracy, documented in a papyrus now known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, records a plot organized by a secondary wife named Tia, who wished to place her son Pentuer on the throne in place of the designated heir. The conspiracy involved a substantial number of court officials, military officers, and harem women, and it apparently succeeded in physically attacking the king. Whether Ramesses III died from his wounds or survived the initial attack long enough to see the conspiracy tried is a question that remained open until 2012, when CT scans of his mummy revealed a deep cut across his throat, almost certainly fatal, concealed beneath his mummy's bandaging. The conspirators were tried, convicted, and variously executed or compelled to take their own lives. Pentuer, the would-be king, was apparently allowed to commit suicide rather than face execution, a distinction whose significance in Egyptian judicial thinking the papyrus does not fully explain. The empire that Ramesses II inscribed on every available surface was contracting toward its core, and the institutions that had sustained it, the professional army, the redistributive economy, The centralized administration were bending under pressures that the name of Ramesses, carved 10,000 times in stone, could not by itself relieve. The new kingdom's last light was dimming, and what came after it was not darkness exactly, but a complexity that the old dynastic categories were insufficient to describe. Chapter 11: The Divided Kingdoms. The end of the new kingdom did not announce itself with a single collapse. It arrived as a gradual redistribution of authority, power draining from the royal center toward the institutional edges, until what remained at the center was the title and the ceremony of kingship, without the administrative and military substance that had given those things meaning. The last Ramessid kings governed from the delta, their attention and resources focused on the north, while Thebes and Upper Egypt passed increasingly into the effective control of the high priests of Amun, officials whose religious authority had always been considerable and whose accumulated land holdings by the end of the 20th dynasty gave them an economic base capable of sustaining independent governance. When the last of the Ramessids died around 1070 BCE, the arrangement that followed was not a succession crisis in the ordinary sense. It was a formalization of a division that had already been functioning for a generation. Egypt entered the third intermediate period as two parallel states occupying the same territorial tradition. In the north, a royal line based at Tanis in the eastern delta, the 21st dynasty, maintained the full pharaonic apparatus, the titulary, the cartouche, the divine kingship ideology, the diplomatic relationships with what remained of the surrounding world. In the south, the high priests of Amun at Thebes governed Upper Egypt with a religious authority that they supplemented with military force and that they legitimized through oracle, the statue of Amun carried in procession, indicating through its movements the divine will on questions of succession, land ownership, and judicial matters, a mechanism that conveniently concentrated interpretive authority in the hands of the priests who carried the statue. The two administrations were not consistently hostile. They were connected by family marriages and by the shared recognition that the fiction of Egyptian unity was more useful to both of them than its formal abandonment. Tanis issued the decrees. Thebes governed its territory. The Nile ran between them, carrying the grain that sustained both. The royal burials at Tanis, discovered largely intact in 1939 by the French archaeologist Pierre Montet, their discovery overshadowed by the outbreak of the Second World War, and consequently far less known than the Tutankhamun find that preceded them by 17 years, reveal a northern court of considerable wealth and artistic sophistication. The silver coffin of Susenes I, the gold mask of Amenemope, the intact burial equipment of several 21st dynasty kings, all of it demonstrates that the reduced political circumstances of the divided kingdom had not extinguished the material culture of Egyptian royal life. The craftsmen who made these objects were working in a tradition whose technical standards had not declined even as the political system around them contracted. The Libyan dynasty that replaced the 21st, the 22nd, founded by Shoshenq the Hur around 945 BCE, represented a different kind of continuity. The Libyans, whose ancestors had served as mercenaries in the Egyptian military during the late New Kingdom, had, over the course of several generations, settled in the Delta and the Fayum, adopted Egyptian language and administrative culture, intermarried with Egyptian priestly and military families, and accumulated local authority of the kind that the Hyksos had accumulated 1,000 years earlier. Shoshenqi's seizure of the throne followed a pattern that by now had Egyptian precedent, a military strongman of foreign origin taking the pharaonic title and governing through the existing administrative apparatus while maintaining the loyalties of his own ethnic community alongside the loyalties he had acquired by becoming Egyptian. His Palestinian campaign, conducted early in his reign, its list of conquered cities inscribed on the wall of the Bubastite portal at Karnak, is recorded in the Hebrew Bible as the campaign of Shishak against Jerusalem, in which the Temple of Solomon was stripped of its treasures to buy off the Egyptian advance. Whether the biblical account and the Egyptian inscription describe precisely the same events or overlapping events rendered through different cultural lenses is a question that biblical archaeology and Egyptology continue to negotiate, but the basic historicity of the campaign is not seriously doubted. It was the last occasion on which an Egyptian king projected military power into the Levant with any significant effect, and its commemoration at Karnak, the same wall that had recorded Thutmose III's campaigns, Seti I battles, Ramesses II's Kadesh, placed it in a tradition of martial accomplishment that its actual strategic significance probably did not fully merit. The campaign was a raid, not a conquest, and Egypt did not hold what Shoshenkai took. The 22nd dynasty's internal cohesion deteriorated across its later generations in a way that had become familiar in Egyptian dynastic history. Provincial branches of the royal family, installed in regional power bases to extend the dynasty's reach, developed local interests that competed with the central authority they were supposed to reinforce. By the 8th century BCE, Egypt was effectively divided among half a dozen competing local rulers, the 23rd, 24th, and fragments of the 22nd dynasty governing different stretches of the valley simultaneously, a political fragmentation more complete than anything since the First Intermediate Period, and one that left the country unable to project coherent authority either domestically or beyond its borders. Into this fragmentation came a kingdom from the south, whose claim to Egyptian legitimacy was, in its own terms, more orthodox than anything the Libyan dynasties had managed. The rulers of Napata, a kingdom centered at the Fourth Cataract in what is now Sudan, whose ruling class had absorbed the Egyptian religious and administrative culture that centuries of Egyptian colonial presence had deposited in Nubia, understood themselves as the true heirs of the pharaonic tradition that the Libyan kings had corrupted. Their god was Amun. Their royal burial customs followed Egyptian precedent. Their court used the Egyptian language for official purposes. When Paya the Napataean king decided to march north into Egypt around 728 BCE, he framed his campaign not as a foreign conquest, but as a restoration, the return of legitimate Amun worship to a country that had allowed it to fall into disorder. The account of Pa's campaign survives on the victory stele he erected at the temple of Amun at Napata after his return, a text of unusual length and literary sophistication that records not just the military events, but the king's emotional and religious responses to them. Pa wept when he saw the condition of the horses that had been starved during one of the sieges, because horses were sacred to him, and their mistreatment was a moral failure on the part of the rulers who had allowed it. He refused to enter Memphis until he had purified himself according to ritual requirements, even as the city lay before him taken. He received the submission of the Delta princes, the various local rulers who came to offer their allegiance after his military success, but refused to meet with those who were ritually impure, which excluded any prince who ate fish or who had not undergone the appropriate ceremonial preparations, a restriction that several of them apparently failed to meet. The stele records these refusals with a matter-of-factness that reveals pious self-understanding. He was not a conqueror tolerating the customs of a conquered people. He was a more orthodox Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, and the religious standards he maintained were the proof of it. His successors consolidated the 25th dynasty's control over a reunified Egypt with varying degrees of success. Shabaka, who followed Pi, governed from Memphis and left building projects across the country that demonstrate the dynasty's intention to be permanent rather than episodic. Taharqa, the most ambitious of the dynasty's kings, whose reign of 26 years brought both its greatest achievements and its terminal crisis, extended the building program at Karnak with a colonnade of enormous papyrus bundle columns, added construction at temples from the delta to the deep south, and governed a reunified Egypt with an administrative energy the country had not seen in a generation. His features appear in a series of small bronze statues, the head slightly forward, the expression of composed determination, that are among the finest surviving portraits from the entire ancient world. The crisis that ended his dynasty arrived from the northeast, where the Assyrian Empire under Esarhaddon had been expanding westward with a military machine of a different order from anything Egypt had faced since the Hyksos. Esarhaddon invaded Egypt in 671 BCE, took Memphis, looted its temples, and withdrew, leaving Egyptian vassals in the delta to manage the north on Assyrian behalf. Taharqa retook Memphis after the Assyrian withdrawal, only to face a second invasion under Esarhaddon's successor Ashurbanipal, whose forces penetrated further south than Esarhaddon's had, past Memphis, past the delta, up the valley to Thebes itself. The Assyrian sack of Thebes in 663 BCE, the destruction of the city that had been Egypt's religious and political heart for 1500 years, the looting of the Amun temple, whose accumulated wealth represented the savings of centuries, resonated through the ancient world as a demonstration of Assyrian power and as a shock to the Egyptian cultural imagination from which the 25th dynasty did not recover. Taharqa's successor Tantamani attempted a reconquest, briefly reoccupying Memphis before the Assyrians came again, and by the end of that campaign, the Nubian kings had retreated permanently to the south, their Egyptian ambitions exhausted by an adversary they could not match in the field. The cache of royal mummies that priests moved during this period, gathering the remains of New Kingdom kings from tombs that had been robbed or threatened and reburying them in a communal hiding place at Deir el-Bahri, was discovered in 1881, its contents including Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses II, among others. The priests who did this work left no record of their reasoning beyond the dockets they attached to the mummies identifying their contents, but the act itself speaks to a continuity of institutional memory and religious obligation that persisted through the Third Intermediate Period's political disorder. Whoever governed Egypt, whoever claimed the pharaonic title, there were people in Thebes who still understood that the bodies of the new kingdom kings were their responsibility, and who acted on that understanding when the bodies were at risk. The Assyrian withdrawal left the delta in the hands of local rulers whom Assyria had installed and who now found themselves released from Assyrian supervision without being strong enough individually to reunite the country. One of them was strong enough to do it with help, and the help he sought came from an unexpected direction, from the Greek mercenaries whose military technology and professional discipline would give the next Egyptian dynasty both its armies and its most consequential foreign relationship. Chapter 12: The Last Native Pharaohs. Psamtik came to power in the Delta around 664 BCE as one of several local rulers operating under nominal Assyrian suzerainty, and he spent the first decade of his reign converting that nominal position into something real. The instrument of his consolidation was the Greek mercenary, soldiers from the Aegean world whose equipment, discipline, and tactical formations gave the armies that employed them a consistent advantage over the lighter forces of their regional competitors. Psamtik recruited them through Ionian and Carian intermediaries, settled them in garrison towns in the delta, and used them to systematically absorb or neutralize the other local rulers until, by around 656 BCE, he controlled a reunified Egypt for the first time in 4 centuries. The Assyrian Empire that had installed him as a vassal was contracting under its own pressures. Babylonian and Median forces were already beginning the campaigns that would sack Nineveh in 612 BCE, and as Assyrian attention withdrew from its western periphery, Psamtik I found himself the master of a country whose overlord had quietly ceased to function. The dynasty he founded, the 26th, known to historians as the Site dynasty after its home city of Sais in the western delta, governed Egypt for 138 years with a stability and cultural ambition that the Third Intermediate Period had made genuinely remarkable by contrast. Its most distinctive intellectual feature was a systematic archaism, a deliberate return to the artistic conventions, religious practices, literary styles, and administrative forms of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, treated not as antiquarianism, but as the recovery of a more authentic Egypt from the distortions of the intervening centuries. Sita sculptors studied Old Kingdom originals with an attention to detail that produced work of exceptional technical quality: the musculature of a Sita bronze figure, the surface treatment of a Sita stone portrait, the proportional systems of Sita relief work all reflect a knowledge of earlier models that required sustained access to those models and a sophisticated understanding of what made them exemplary. The archaism was not nostalgic in the sentimental sense. It was a political and cultural argument that the Site dynasty was the legitimate continuation of the great Egyptian tradition interrupted by the Libyan and Nubian interlopers, and that its authority derived from its fidelity to the tradition those interlopers had compromised. Copying the art of the Old Kingdom was a claim about which Egypt was the real one. It was also, incidentally, some of the finest art Egypt had produced in 500 years, which suggests that the argument was made with genuine aesthetic intelligence rather than mere ideological convenience. The trading port of Naucratis, established in the western delta under Psamtik Wars, or his successor, probably in the late 7th century BCE, was one of the most consequential administrative decisions of the Seti period. It designated a single location in Egypt where Greek merchants could settle, build their own temples, conduct their own civic life, and trade under conditions regulated by the Egyptian state. The arrangement was neither fully open nor fully restrictive. It channeled Greek commercial activity into a defined space where it could be administered and taxed, while preventing the kind of dispersed Greek settlement that might produce the unmanageable foreign communities that the Delta had accumulated during the Hyksos and Third Intermediate periods. Greek merchants got reliable access to Egyptian grain, linen, papyrus, and luxury goods. Egypt got Greek silver, olive oil, wine, and the commercial connections that linked it to the expanding Greek world of the Mediterranean. Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and devoted the second book of his histories to what he saw and was told there, a text that is simultaneously invaluable and exasperating, accurate in its geography and its general cultural observations, unreliable in its specific historical claims, and fascinating throughout as a record of what a Greek intellectual of the classical period understood Egypt to mean. He found a country that presented itself to outside observers as the oldest and wisest of civilizations, whose priests were guardians of a knowledge so ancient that Greek traditions were by comparison recent inventions. Whether the Egyptian priests who told Herodotus these things were reporting genuine institutional memory or constructing a useful mythology for a credulous foreign audience is a question that remains open, but the image of Egypt as the origin of civilization, the source from which Greek religion, philosophy, and mathematics had derived their essential content, was one that the Sete dynasty and its successors had strong reasons to cultivate, and that their Greek visitors had strong inclinations to accept. The Persian conquest that ended the Site dynasty arrived in 525 BCE under Cambyses II, who crossed the Sinai with a large army after securing the cooperation of Arab tribes who could supply water across the desert route, and met the Egyptian forces under the last Site king, Spamtik III, at the Battle of Pelusium in the eastern delta. The Egyptian defeat was decisive. Smamtik III was captured and later executed after an alleged escape attempt, and Egypt became a satrapy, a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Cambyses II was crowned pharaoh in the traditional manner and took Egyptian royal titles, but the ancient sources, particularly the Egyptian priestly tradition as recorded by Manetho and the Greek tradition as recorded by Herodotus, portray him as a violent and contemptuous ruler who desecrated Egyptian temples, mocked Egyptian religion, and behaved with a cruelty that Egyptian memory preserved with considerable vividness. The accuracy of this portrait is genuinely debated among modern historians. The Persian administrative records from Egypt suggest a ruler who worked within existing institutional frameworks rather than systematically destroying them, who confirmed temple landholdings, maintained existing administrative personnel, and presented himself to Egyptian subjects through the standard pharaonic apparatus. The hostile accounts in the Egyptian and Greek traditions may reflect the perspective of a priestly class whose institutional privileges were reduced by Persian administrative rationalization, or the natural tendency of a conquered people to remember their conquerors in the worst available light, or some combination of both. What is clear is that the Persian conquest was experienced as a rupture, as the end of something, even if the administrative reality was more continuous than the cultural memory acknowledged. The First Persian period, the 27th dynasty, lasted until 404 BCE, when a series of Egyptian revolts, exploiting Persian preoccupation with conflicts elsewhere in the empire, succeeded in re-establishing native rule. The three dynasties that followed, the 28th, 29th, and 30th, represent the last generations of native Egyptian kingship, and their history is one of sustained military effort to maintain independence against a Persian empire that repeatedly attempted reconquest. The 28th dynasty produced a single king, Amyrtaeus of Sais, who governed for 6 years largely by making himself ungovernable in the delta marshes. The 29th dynasty, based at Mendes, lasted 20 years across 4 kings. The 30th dynasty, based at Sebennytos, produced 3 kings and lasted 38 years, long enough to constitute something resembling stability, and the last of its kings, Nectanebo II, was both a significant builder and a capable military commander whose reign suggested that native Egyptian kingship might yet have decades ahead of it. Nectanebo II's building program extended the length of the country with a consistency that the disruptions of the Third Intermediate Period and the Persian occupation had interrupted. At Philae, the island at the First Cataract, whose temple complex would become one of the last active centers of traditional Egyptian religion, he built structures that began a construction sequence continuing through the Ptolemaic period. At the Delta sites, at the Fayum temples, at Karnak, his cartouches appear on additions and restorations that reflect a king actively maintaining the institutional fabric of Egyptian religious life rather than merely claiming its symbols. He also cultivated Greek mercenaries and Greek military alliances with the same pragmatism that the Saite dynasty had used. The Greek world's military technology remained indispensable to any Egyptian force attempting to resist Persian pressure. The Second Persian conquest came in 343 BCE under Artaxerxes III, and it came with a decisiveness that the first had lacked. Nectanebo II's forces were defeated at Pelusium and in the Delta fighting that followed, and the king fled south with the remnants of his army, eventually disappearing from the Egyptian record. Later tradition placed him in Nubia, to which he retreated with his treasury and his court, living out his remaining years among the Nubian kingdoms that had maintained a relationship with Egyptian culture since the Middle Kingdom's fortress system had first bound the two regions together. His fate is unknown. His successors do not exist. The 30th dynasty ended with his flight, and the native Egyptian kingship that had persisted in one form or another since Narmer joined the crowns 3,000 years earlier was over. The Second Persian period lasted only a decade. It was ended not by an Egyptian revolt, but by a Macedonian king who arrived from the north in 3032 BCE and was welcomed by Egyptians who had experienced a decade of Persian rule under the 31st dynasty as something close to a liberator. His name was Alexander, and what he brought with him would transform Egypt more thoroughly than anything since the Nile itself had organized the civilization that the river's banks had made possible. Chapter 13: The Greek Pharaohs. Alexander arrived in Egypt in the autumn of 332 BCE and encountered almost no military resistance. The Persian satrap Mazaces, holding the country with a garrison depleted by Artaxerxes III's campaigns elsewhere, had no realistic prospect of defending it against the force that had already destroyed the Persian armies at Granicus and Issus, and he surrendered Memphis and the royal treasury without a battle. The Egyptians who watched this transfer of authority had lived through a decade of the Second Persian occupation and had reasons to receive its end with something other than grief. Alexander was welcomed, and the welcome was not merely tactical acquiescence. The Egyptian priestly establishment recognized in the young Macedonian king an opportunity, a new ruler willing to present himself through pharaonic forms, to honor the temples, to perform the rituals, to be depicted on monument walls in the double crown smiting the enemies of order, everything the Persian kings had done imperfectly or not at all. He was installed as pharaoh at Memphis in the traditional manner, sacrificing to the Apis bull, whose living presence in the Memphis temple was the most sacred single object in Egyptian religion, and whose neglect by Persian rulers had been one of the primary charges in the Egyptian priestly indictment of Persian governance. He then made a journey that was not militarily necessary and not administratively urgent, but that he appears to have considered essential, a crossing of the western desert to the oasis of Siwa, where the oracle of Amun-Ra, known to the Greek world as the oracle of Zeus Ammon, delivered to him an answer whose content he never publicly disclosed. The ancient sources agree that the oracle addressed him as the son of the god. They disagree on almost everything else. What Alexander understood the oracle to mean, what it confirmed or complicated in his own sense of his nature and his mission, belongs to the interior life of a man who did not write memoirs and who died at 32, leaving the question permanently open. He spent less than a year in Egypt. Before leaving to pursue Darius III into the Persian heartland, he founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, at a site he had identified himself, a narrow strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis, with a natural harbor capable of accommodating the largest fleets of the ancient world, positioned at the western edge of the delta where the prevailing winds would carry ships efficiently across the Mediterranean to Greece and the Aegean. He named it Alexandria, marked out its basic plan, and left it to be built while he went east to conquer the rest of the world. He never returned. When he died at Babylon in 323 BCE at 32 years of age, his body was eventually brought back to Alexandria and interred there, the city he had founded and never seen completed, becoming his permanent home in death. The empire he left behind was divided among his generals in a series of negotiations and wars that lasted 2 decades and produced several stable successor kingdoms. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who had been one of Alexander's closest companions and most capable officers, and who had, with considerable shrewdness, secured Egypt as his portion of the inheritance before the full extent of the territorial fragmentation was clear. Ptolemy I Soter, Soter meaning savior, a title given him by the Rhodians for his assistance during a siege, governed Egypt initially as satrap, and then, after 305 BCE, as king, founding the dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and that would prove, in the end, more durably Egyptian than it initially appeared. The Ptolemaic approach to Egyptian governance was pragmatic in a way that produced, over time, something more than pragmatism. The dynasty adopted the full pharaonic apparatus for Egyptian language contexts, the cartouches, the divine birth narratives, the temple building program conducted entirely in traditional Egyptian architectural and iconographic conventions, the royal participation in the great religious festivals that organized Egyptian civic and agricultural life. At Edfu, the Temple of Horus, built under the Ptolemies between 237 and 57 BCE, is the best preserved ancient Egyptian temple in existence, its walls covered in reliefs and inscriptions executed in a style so faithful to Old Kingdom conventions that only the cartouches of the Ptolemaic kings identify the period of its construction. At Dendera, at Philae, at Komombo, the same pattern repeated. Ptolemaic kings depicted as pharaohs, worshipping Egyptian gods, maintaining Egyptian ritual in Egyptian language, their Greek names transliterated into hieroglyphs, and enclosed in cartouches whose form had not changed in 3,000 years. The Greek language context told a different story, or rather, the same story in a different register. Alexandria, which was, in the memorable phrase attributed to its inhabitants, Alexandria beside Egypt rather than Alexandria in Egypt, was a Greek city in its culture, its civic organization, its intellectual life, and its language of administration. The museum and library that Ptolemy the First founded and his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus expanded were institutions of the Greek intellectual world, repositories of Greek texts, homes to Greek scholars, sites of Greek philosophical and scientific inquiry. The library's ambition to collect every book written in the Greek world and to make Alexandria the center from which the intellectual production of the Mediterranean could be surveyed was realized to an extent that gave the city a cultural prestige that outlasted the dynasty by centuries. Euclid worked in Alexandria. Archimedes studied there. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, using the angle of the sun's shadow at 2 points on the Nile on the summer solstice, served as the library's chief librarian. The Pharaohs Lighthouse, built on the island of Pharaohs in Alexandria's harbor under Ptolemy II, its construction supervised by the architect Sostratus of Cnidus, rose to a height that ancient sources place between 100 and 140 meters, making it among the tallest structures in the ancient world. Its fire, reflected by mirrors of polished bronze, was visible from the sea at a distance that different ancient sources estimate at between 30 and 50 kilometers, and it functioned as a navigation aid for the commercial traffic that made Alexandria the busiest port in the Mediterranean. The lighthouse became one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, which is a category the Hellenistic world invented to organize its sense of its own achievement, and it stood until a series of earthquakes damaged and eventually destroyed it in the medieval period, its stonework eventually incorporated into the Mamluk fort that still occupies the same island. The Ptolemaic administration of Egypt required a bureaucracy capable of governing a country whose population spoke primarily Egyptian, specifically the late Egyptian vernacular form known as Demotic, through officials who were primarily Greek-speaking. The solution was a layered administrative system in which Greek remained the language of the highest levels of government and of the law courts, while Egyptian continued to function in local administration, temple affairs, and the everyday transactions of the farming population. Lingual documents, contracts, decrees, administrative orders surviving on papyrus in the dry Egyptian soil record this duality in practice, the same content in two languages, sometimes two scripts, addressed to constituencies that could read one or the other or both. The Rosetta Stone is the most famous artifact of this administrative bilingualism, though its fame owes less to its original function than to what it became. Inscribed in 196 BCE on the occasion of a priestly council held at Memphis to honor the young king Ptolemy V Epiphanes, it records a decree in Greek, in Demotic Egyptian, and in hieroglyphic Egyptian, confirming the king's benefactions to the temples and the privileges of the priestly class in return for the performance of his cult. It was, in its original context, a routine document of the Ptolemaic system, a negotiation between the crown and the priesthood expressed in the formal language of mutual obligation, inscribed on stone for public display according to the decree's own instructions. When it was found by French soldiers in 1799 during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, and when the scholar Thomas Young and then the linguist Jean-François Champollion worked through the parallel texts in the early 19th century to achieve the decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822, the stone became the key that unlocked 5,000 years of Egyptian written record, an administrative document of the Ptolemaic bureaucracy serving, across 2 millennia, as the cipher for an entire civilization's literature. The dynasty's later generations brought increasing instability, succession struggles, sibling wars, interference from Rome as the Mediterranean world reorganized around Roman power, and the relationship between the Ptolemaic court and Rome became the defining diplomatic reality of the dynasty's final century. The Ptolemies needed Roman military support to survive their own internal divisions. Rome needed Egyptian grain to feed its expanding population. The leverage ran in both directions and was exercised with the particular ruthlessness of parties who understood they needed each other and resented the fact. It is worth pausing here on a matter of time. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, whose story closes the next chapter, lived closer in time to the moon landing of 1969 than to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The pyramid was already 2,500 years old when she was born. She is separated from us by roughly 2,000 years. The civilization whose last pharaoh she was had been continuous for 5 millennia before she inherited it, which means that what feels to us like the remote ancient world was, to her, a tradition so old that its own origins were as distant from her as she is from us. She ruled at the end of something so long that its beginning was already mythological to those living within it. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, pursuing his enemy Pompey, who had been assassinated on the Egyptian shore before Caesar could reach him. He found a kingdom in the middle of a civil war. Cleopatra VII had been deposed by her younger brother Ptolemy XIII's faction and was in exile in the eastern delta, and a situation whose complications were both military and dynastic. The manner of Cleopatra's return to the capital and to Caesar's presence, wrapped in a carpet or a linen sack, smuggled past her brother's guards, delivered to the Roman general who held the city's fate in his hands, is one of the most famous scenes in ancient history, reported by Plutarch with a vividness that suggests it was already legendary in antiquity. What happened between Caesar and Cleopatra in the months that followed changed the political calculus of both their worlds, and it set in motion a sequence of events whose conclusion was still a decade and a half away. The young queen who unrolled herself before the most powerful man in the Roman world had been educated in the Alexandrian tradition, mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, the sciences of the museum, and spoke, according to the ancient sources, 9 languages, including Egyptian, which made her the first ruler of her dynasty in nearly 3 centuries to communicate directly with the majority of her subjects without an interpreter. Whether the source's claim of 9 languages is precisely accurate or an approximate measure of exceptional linguistic ability, the Egyptian detail is historically significant. A Ptolemaic queen who spoke Egyptian was a different kind of ruler than one who did not, and the relationship with the priestly establishment that Egyptian language made possible was a political resource that her predecessors had administered at one remove. What she intended to do with that resource and how close she came to succeeding is where the chronicle turns next. Chapter 14: The Last Queen and the Long Silence. Cleopatra VII was, above everything else, a politician of exceptional ability operating in circumstances that would have defeated a less resourceful ruler within months. She had been deposed once before Caesar arrived and would face further attempts to remove her throughout her reign from her younger brother, from her younger sister Arsinoe, from the factions within the Alexandrian court, whose loyalty was always provisional and whose assessment of her position was continuous and unsentimental. The alliance with Caesar that her return to Alexandria initiated was not, in its primary logic, a romantic event. It was a survival calculation made by a 21-year-old queen who understood that the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean world had arrived in her capital and that her relationship to it would determine whether she had a kingdom to govern. That the calculation produced a genuine personal attachment is attested by the ancient sources and not in serious doubt. But the attachment grew from a political decision, not the other way around, and understanding Cleopatra's reign requires keeping that sequence clear. Caesar's months in Alexandria were militarily dangerous in ways that the later Romantic tradition tended to obscure. The Alexandrian War, the fighting that broke out between Caesar's forces and the Ptolemaic army loyal to Ptolemy XIII in the winter of 48 to 47 BCE, was a serious military engagement in which Caesar was badly outnumbered, confined to the royal quarter of the city, dependent on naval support, and at one point compelled to swim for his life when an Egyptian attack threatened to cut off his retreat. The famous burning of the library, or of a warehouse of books near the harbor, which later tradition conflated with the library itself, occurred during this fighting, the fire from the docks spreading to adjacent buildings in the chaos of a night engagement. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the final battle, his army defeated by Caesar's reinforcements, and Cleopatra emerged from the war as sole ruler, nominally sharing the throne with her youngest brother Ptolemy XIV, as Egyptian convention required but governing in practice, without meaningful constraint from that arrangement. Caesar remained in Egypt long enough to father a son, Caesarion, whose formal name was Ptolemy Caesar, born in 47 BCE, and to conduct the famous journey up the Nile that the ancient sources describe as a royal progress through the country's interior, Cleopatra showing the Roman general the civilization whose last ruler she was. Whether Caesar was moved by what he saw, by the age of the temples, by the scale of the monuments, by the continuity of an institutional tradition that made Rome look young, the sources do not record with any precision. He left Egypt in the spring of 47 BCE to continue his campaigns and did not return. His assassination on the Ides of March in 44 BCE destabilized everything that Cleopatra's position depended on. Caesarion, 3 years old, acknowledged by Caesar in a general sense, but not formally adopted as his Roman heir, supplanted in that role by the posthumous adoption of his great-nephew Octavian, was the thread connecting the Ptolemaic kingdom to Roman power, and the thread had just been cut. The civil war that followed Caesar's death among his successors and assassins required Cleopatra to navigate competing Roman factions without the protector who had originally secured her position and her management of that navigation, sending assistance to Caesar's faction while carefully avoiding overcommitment to any single outcome, was the work of a ruler who understood that Egypt's independence depended on Roman disunity and that preserving that disunity was therefore a legitimate foreign policy objective. Mark Antony arrived at Tarsus in 41 BCE, summoning Cleopatra to explain her conduct during the civil wars, and she came in a manner that Plutarch describes with a set-piece elaboration that became, through Shakespeare, one of the most famous passages in the literature of the ancient world. She arrived on a gilded barge, attended by women dressed as sea nymphs, the air around the vessel thick with the smoke of burning spice, the oarsmen keeping time to flute music. The staging was deliberate and precise, a performance of Ptolemaic royal magnificence calculated to remind a Roman general that the ruler he had summoned was not a supplicant, but a queen whose resources and whose lineage dwarfed anything Rome's relatively recent history could offer. Antony, who was conducting his audience in the marketplace of Tarsus, found that the marketplace had emptied as the city's population went to the waterfront to watch her arrive. The alliance that followed lasted a decade and produced 3 children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus, alongside a series of territorial donations that Antony made to Cleopatra and her children from the eastern provinces under his control, restoring portions of the old Ptolemaic Empire that the dynasty had lost in the preceding century. The donations were the most politically damaging thing Antony did in Roman eyes, not because the territories were essential to Roman governance, but because the act of giving Roman-administered land to a foreign queen confirmed the narrative that Octavian's propaganda was constructing, that Antony had gone native, had surrendered his Roman identity to an Eastern enchantress, and represented a threat to the Roman order that the Roman world needed to confront and defeat. The war that came was framed by Octavian as a war against Cleopatra rather than against Antony, a legal and rhetorical maneuver that allowed him to present the conflict as a foreign war rather than a civil war, which carried different legal implications and different emotional resonances for the Roman public. The declaration of war against Cleopatra personally was accompanied by the publication of what Octavian claimed was Antony's will, deposited with the Vestal Virgins in Rome and removed by Octavian in a legally dubious act, which allegedly confirmed that Antony intended to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra and to leave Roman territories to their children. Whether the document was genuine, altered, or fabricated entirely is a question whose answer died with those who handled it. The Battle of Actium, fought on the 2nd of September in 31 BCE, off the promontory of Actium on the western coast of Greece, was a naval engagement that both sides had arrived at after months of encampment, during which disease, desertion, and supply failures had weakened Antony and Cleopatra's forces more severely than the fighting itself. Cleopatra's fleet of 60 ships held a position in the battle's center, and when the engagement turned against them, Antony's northern squadron beginning to give way, the outcome becoming legible, she took her squadron through a gap in the fighting and sailed south toward Egypt, taking with her the Ptolemaic treasury and the strategic reserve that represented the financial foundation of any continued resistance. Antony followed with a handful of ships, abandoning the bulk of his forces to surrender or defection. The decision to break off and retreat rather than fight to destruction has been debated across 2 millennia, attributed alternatively to cowardice, to a prearranged plan to preserve assets for a continued campaign from Egypt, or to a rational assessment that the battle was lost and that preserving the treasury gave them a basis for negotiation that staying to be destroyed would not. What the retreat unambiguously ended was any prospect of defeating Octavian in the field. The land forces that Antony had left behind surrendered within days. The client kings of the East, who had supported Antony's position throughout the war, began their defections before the month was out. Octavian's movement toward Egypt, when it came the following year, was a campaign of consolidation rather than conquest. The outcome had been decided at Actium, and what remained was its administrative completion. Antony died in Alexandria in August of 30 BCE, having received a false report of Cleopatra's death and having fallen on his sword in the Roman manner, only to be brought to where she was actually sheltering. She had taken refuge in her mausoleum, a structure she had prepared in advance with her treasury and her most valued possessions, and dying from his wound in her presence. The scene that Plutarch describes has the quality of theater because it was theater in the sense that both participants understood the historical and literary weight of what was happening and played their roles in it with the full awareness that the roles would outlast them. Antony died as a Roman general. Cleopatra survived him by approximately 10 days. Those 10 days were the last serious political negotiation of her life. She met with Octavian, who came to Alexandria and received her in the mausoleum, and the ancient accounts of that meeting suggest she attempted to reach an arrangement, her children's security, perhaps her own continued role in governing Egypt, perhaps simply a death on her own terms rather than in a Roman triumph. What Octavian intended for her, whether he planned to parade her through Rome in chains or to leave her alive in some administrative capacity, is genuinely uncertain. His intentions may have been uncertain even to himself. What is clear is that she read the situation accurately enough to understand that her options were narrowing, and that she chose to end her life before those options closed entirely. The manner of her death is the most debated detail of a reign full of debated details. The asp, the Egyptian cobra, whose bite the ancient sources describe as inducing a painless sleep-like death, is the traditional account, and it carries the weight of symbolism that Cleopatra would have understood. The cobra was the uraeus, the royal serpent that adorned the brow of every pharaoh, the symbol of divine kingship and divine protection. To die by the cobra was to die as a pharaoh, wrapped in the symbol of everything she had been. Whether the asp was smuggled to her in a basket of figs, as Plutarch reports, or whether she used a different poison, a pin, a prepared vial, something the Roman guards who found her did not detect, is a question that the physical evidence cannot answer. Octavian's physicians, sent to the mausoleum when her death was discovered, found two small puncture marks on her arm, which may have been snake bites or may have been something else. The ambiguity seems appropriate for a woman whose entire reign had consisted of managing ambiguity in the service of survival, and who, in this final instance, managed it in the service of something else. Caesarion was executed within days of her death, Octavian accepting the counsel attributed to one of his advisers that two Caesars were one too many. The three children she had with Antony were taken to Rome and paraded in Octavian's triumph, the twins wearing golden chains fashioned in the shape of the shackles they were too young to carry, a cruelty of staging that reflected the Roman triumph's unembarrassed theatricality. They were subsequently raised by Octavian's sister Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, whom he had set aside for Cleopatra, in an arrangement whose particular irony the ancient sources note without further comment. Cleopatra Selene eventually married the Numidian king Juba Theot and governed a North African kingdom competently for decades, the last of her mother's children to exercise political authority. Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BCE, its status within the Roman system unique and deliberately so. Octavian, who became Augustus in 27 BCE, the first Roman emperor, the architect of the principate that would govern the Mediterranean world for the next several centuries, classified Egypt as his personal property rather than a senatorial province, administered by a prefect appointed directly by him and forbidden to senior Roman senators without imperial permission. The reason was the grain. Egypt's agricultural surplus, flowing into the imperial granaries at Alexandria, and from there to Rome and the legions, was the material foundation of imperial power, and Augustus had no intention of allowing any rival to control it. The Nile Valley became, in effect, the emperor's farm, its administrative distinctiveness reflecting the fundamental economic role it played in sustaining the system that replaced the republic. The temples continued. Egyptian priests in the Roman period depicted Augustus and his successors on temple walls in the full pharaonic iconography, smiting enemies, offering to gods, wearing the double crown, and the hieroglyphic inscriptions beside these images were grammatically and theologically indistinguishable from inscriptions carved 1,000 years earlier. The Egyptians who maintained these temples were not performing a cynical formality. The rituals the inscriptions recorded were still conducted, the festivals still celebrated, the gods still present in the theological understanding of the communities that served them. The pharaonic tradition did not end with Cleopatra. It continued in the temples for 3 more centuries, its living practitioners growing fewer, and its written record less frequently produced as the administrative and educational structures that had trained hieroglyphic scribes contracted, and eventually ceased. The last dated hieroglyphic inscription in the historical record was carved at Philae, the island temple at the First Cataract, one of the last active centers of the old religion, whose remote location had insulated it from the Christianization spreading through the Roman Empire on the 24th of August in the year 394 CE. The man who carved it was a priest named Esmet Achom, son of Esmet, a servant of the god Mandulus. The inscription records nothing of historical consequence, a dedication, a priestly title, a date. It is a routine act of temple administration of the kind that priests had been performing for 5,000 years, and it is the last one. After Esmet Achom set down his chisel, no one carved another hieroglyphic text that history has found. The stone at Philae is still there. The chisel marks Esmet Achom made are still legible, the signs still holding the shapes that Imhotep's contemporaries would have recognized, that the scribes who copied the tale of Sinuhe would have read without difficulty, that the priests of Amun who hid the royal mummies at Deir el-Bahri wrote on the dockets they attached to the kings. The same marks, the same hands, the same unbroken chain of transmission reaching back to the proto-hieroglyphs on the pottery labels of the Nakada III chieftains who lived before the dynasty began. Outside the temple, the river continued. It had been continuing before the first chieftain scratched the first sign into the first clay surface, and it continued after the last priest set down the last chisel in a room that grew quiet and stayed quiet. The silt arrived each year in its season, dark and fine, spreading across the basin fields in the old pattern, withdrawing to leave behind the soil that had fed every civilization the valley had ever produced. The fields turned green. The grain grew. The flood receded, as it always had, into the river that held everything this chronicle has followed from its beginning, the oldest continuous human story the earth has kept, deposited year by year into the same dark ground. The journey is complete. Rest well.